Hello there, my sleepy souls. Tonight, we journey through the hidden secrets of Midnight Sun. The story you thought you knew, but told through the mind that could hear every thought except the one that mattered most. Edward Cullen spent a century listening to the endless noise of human consciousness before encountering the silent mind of Isabella Swan. The ordinary girl whose blood sang to him like no other, and whose thoughts remained mysteriously, impossibly, maddeningly quiet. I'm pouring my heart into these videos, and sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it. And then one of you leaves the sweetest comment, and it reminds me why I'm doing this. I haven't hit my goal of 1,000 subs yet, but I'm not giving up. If you want to support a small creator who's trying to make something beautiful, please consider subscribing. Alright, let's settle in. Close your eyes. Let Edward's hidden world and secret thoughts and unspoken fears carry you gently into rest. Edward Anthony Mason was born on the 20th of June in 1901 in Chicago, Illinois. During the final year of Queen Victoria's reign, and during the early years of the Progressive Era, when America was transforming from agricultural society into industrial power, and when cities like Chicago were growing explosively through immigration and through technological innovation that was reshaping how people lived and worked and understood their place in rapidly modernizing world. His father was Edward Mason Sr., a successful lawyer who had built prosperous practice serving Chicago's business community, and who had accumulated comfortable wealth through careful investments and through professional reputation that brought him clients from among the city's rising merchant class. His mother was Elizabeth Mason, a woman of refinement and education, who had married well and who had ambitions for her only son that extended beyond mere financial success into realms of culture and accomplishment that she believed distinguished truly civilized people from those who merely possess money without possessing taste or intellectual development. Edward's childhood was characterized by privilege and by careful cultivation of talents that his mother recognized early and that she encouraged through the best instruction that money could provide in city that was becoming cultural center to rival the Eastern establishments of New York and Boston. He showed musical aptitude from age 5 when his small fingers first touched piano keys and produced sounds that were not random, but that suggested innate understanding of melody and harmony that could not be taught, but could only be refined through practice and through formal training with masters who could develop natural gifts into genuine artistic ability. Elizabeth hired the finest piano teachers available in Chicago and ensured that Edward's education included not just the practical subjects that would prepare him for law or business, but also the humanities and the arts that she believed were essential to becoming a complete human being rather than merely successful professional. The piano became Edward's refuge and became his primary means of expression, his compositions revealing emotional depth that his reserved personality rarely displayed in conversation or in social situations where Mason family expectations required appropriate behavior and appropriate emotional restraint that wealthy families considered marks of good breeding and proper upbringing. The Great War that began in Europe in 1914, when Edward was 13 years old, seemed distant and seemed irrelevant to most Americans who believed that European conflicts were not their concern, and who wanted to maintain the neutrality that would protect American commerce and American lives from the devastation that was consuming the old world through mechanized slaughter that exceeded anything previous wars had produced. Edward's teenage years unfolded against background of increasing tension as the war dragged on, and as American neutrality became harder to maintain when German submarines were sinking American ships, and when propaganda from both sides was shaping American public opinion toward eventual intervention that came in 1917, when President Wilson asked Congress to declare war and to send American forces across the Atlantic to fight alongside the Allies against the Central Powers. His father followed the war news closely and discussed the political implications with Edward during dinners where conversation was expected to be intelligent and informed rather than trivial or merely social. The Mason household valuing intellectual engagement and valuing awareness of world events, even when those events seem safely distant from Chicago's comfortable streets and from the insulated world that wealth and privilege created for families who could afford to ignore the hardships that working-class families experienced daily. Edward's life in 1918 was focused on completing his final year of secondary school and on preparing for university education that his parents assumed would lead to law degree and to partnership in his father's firm, or to independent practice that would maintain the family's social position and would extend the Mason name into the next generation with appropriate success and appropriate respectability. He was 17 years old in the spring of 1918, when the Spanish influenza pandemic began its first wave through American cities, the disease initially seeming like normal seasonal flu that would pass without extraordinary concern or extraordinary precaution. The second wave that arrived in autumn of 1918 was different and was devastating, the virus having mutated into form that killed with terrifying speed, and that killed particularly the young and healthy, rather than killing primarily the elderly and the already weak, as normal influenza typically did. The medical community was baffled by the pattern and was overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of patients flooding hospitals and filling emergency wards beyond capacity, while doctors and nurses struggled to provide care with limited understanding of viral disease and with limited treatments beyond supportive measures that sometimes helped and sometimes merely delayed inevitable death. September of 1918 brought the pandemic to Chicago with full force. The disease spreading through the crowded city where people lived in close quarters and where public health infrastructure was overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of sick and dying patients who needed care that hospitals could not provide, when medical staff themselves were falling ill, and when understanding of the disease was limited to observation of symptoms, without understanding of viral mechanisms or without effective treatments beyond supportive care that sometimes help patients survive and sometimes merely prolong their suffering before inevitable death. Edward Mason Sr. contracted the flu in early September and died within 3 days, his robust health and his 50 years of life offering no protection against virus that killed without regard to social class or to previous good health or to desperate prayers from family members who watched helplessly as their loved ones drowned in their own lungs as the disease filled airways with fluid and caused respiratory failure that no medicine could prevent and that no intervention could reverse once the infection had progressed beyond certain point that doctors could recognize but could not predict or prevent. Elizabeth Mason became ill within days of her husband's death. Her exposure to the virus during her nursing of him, ensuring that she would follow him into sickness, even as she tried to maintain household, and tried to care for Edward, who was also showing symptoms and who was also sliding into the delirium and the respiratory distress that characterized the killer flu. She moved Edward to hospital against his protests. Her determination that he should have professional medical care overriding his desire to remain home where he could be with her, rather than being separated in sterile hospital ward, where strangers would tend to him, while she died alone in their house that had once been filled with music and conversation, and normal life that seemed impossibly distant from the nightmare that September had become. The hospital was overcrowded and understaffed, the rows of beds filled with patients in various stages of the disease, while nurses and doctors moved between them, providing what comfort they could and what treatments their limited knowledge suggested might help, even though most patients would die, regardless of intervention, because the virus was too aggressive and the human body's defenses were too weak against pathogen that attacked with speed and with lethality that normal diseases did not possess. Elizabeth Mason found the doctor who was treating her son and spoke to him with the clarity that sometimes came to dying patients during brief periods when fever reduced and when consciousness returned temporarily before final decline into death. She looked at Dr. Carlisle Cullen with eyes that saw more than they should have seen, and said words that he would remember for centuries afterward, when he wondered at the coincidences that brought certain humans into his path, at moments when his intervention could save them or could condemn them, depending on perspective and depending on outcome. She said save him with intensity that conveyed both plea and command, her hand gripping his arm with strength that her dying body should not have possessed, her gaze holding his with understanding that seemed to recognize what he was, even though such recognition should have been impossible for woman who had never encountered supernatural and who had no framework for understanding that the doctor treating her son was not human and was not mortal and was capable of salvation that normal medicine could not provide. Her final words before releasing his arm and before returning to her own deathbed were precise and were desperate. What others cannot do, that is what you must do for my Edward. Carlisle Cullen had been doctor for centuries by 1918. His unusual existence as vampire, who chose to save human lives rather than to take them, marking him as aberration among his kind, and marking him as lonely figure who moved through human society, while belonging to it only superficially and only temporarily before aging, would force relocation and force assumption of new identity in new city, when no one knew him, and where he could begin again the pattern of helping humans, while hiding his true nature from everyone except the rare few he chose to transform, when circumstances aligned to make transformation seem like mercy rather than like curse. He had transformed others before Edward Marsan, and had watched some of them adapt successfully to vampire existence, while others had struggled and had eventually chosen to end their immortal lives through methods that circumvented vampires' natural durability and vampires' instinctive drive to survive regardless of conscious wishes to die. The decision to transform Edward was made in the moment when Elizabeth Mason died, and when her son was hours from following her into death. Carlyle's assessment of the 17-year-old patient, showing all the signs of terminal illness that would kill him before dawn, unless supernatural intervention changed the trajectory from death to undeath that vampires occupied in space between mortal life and actual cessation of existence. Edward was unconscious when Carlyle carried him from the hospital to the house that Carlyle maintained for exactly these purposes, the isolated residence on the outskirts of Chicago, providing privacy that transformation required when 3 days of screaming would alert neighbors and would bring police and would create situations that Carlyle wished to avoid through careful planning and through maintaining dual existence as respectable doctor and as secret vampire who occasionally saved dying patients through methods that medicine did not recognize and that science could not explain. The bite delivered venom into Edward's bloodstream and began the transformation that would stop his heart and would reorganize his cells and would remake him as a vampire over the course of 72 hours of agony that exceeded any pain human existence could inflict, and that exceeded any torture human imagination could devise, because the pain was cellular and was absolute and was unending throughout the transformation period, when consciousness remained, but when body was paralyzed, and when screaming was only internal, because vocal cords would not respond to desperate need to express the suffering that was consuming every atom of dying human body and creating immortal vampire body in its place. Carlyle stayed with Edward throughout the transformation, as he stayed with all those he transformed. His presence, constant, and his voice occasionally breaking through the pain to explain what was happening, and to promise that the burning would end, and that Edward would emerge from the ordeal as something different and something stronger, and something that would never again know human weakness or human mortality. The awakening that came when the transformation completed was disorienting for all newborn vampires who emerged into existence, where every sense was magnified, and where every perception was sharper, and where physical capabilities exceeded anything human body could achieve, regardless of training or conditioning. But for Edward, the awakening was more disorienting and more overwhelming than normal newborn experience, because along with the enhanced senses and the supernatural strength came the gift that would define his vampire existence and would shape every interaction and would create unique form of awareness that no other vampire possessed in exactly the same way. He could hear thoughts, not as vague impressions or as emotional resonances, but as clear voices speaking in his mind with the same clarity that spoken words would have if they were being said aloud directly to him. The cacophony of voices was immediate and was overwhelming. Carlyle's thoughts coming through clearly as he monitored Edward's awakening, and as he worried about how the newborn would respond to the transformation, and whether he would accept the vegetarian lifestyle that Carlyle practiced, or whether he would rebel and would choose to hunt humans as most vampires did, because human blood was natural diet and was more satisfying and was more complete nutrition than animal blood could ever provide, despite being adequate for survival. The gift of reading minds was both blessing and curse from the first moment of its manifestation. The ability providing Edward with knowledge and with understanding that other vampires lacked, but also providing him with isolation and with awareness that made genuine connection nearly impossible, when he knew every thought and every hidden motive and every secret desire of everyone around him, except those rare individuals whose minds were closed to him through shields or through other gifts that blocked his telepathic sense. He learned quickly that humans thought constantly and thought chaotically, their minds jumping from topic to topic without coherent narrative and without the focus that their spoken words suggested when they were engaging in conversation, or when they were presenting themselves as rational beings with clear intentions and consistent personalities. The gap between what people thought and what people said was vast and was disturbing. The casual lies and the performative kindness and the hidden malice all visible to Edward in ways that made him cynical about human nature and made him question whether authentic goodness existed, or whether everyone was merely performing virtue while thinking selfish thoughts and planning selfish actions that contradicted their public presentations and their spoken commitments to morality and decency. Carlyle's thoughts were different from most humans' thoughts and were different from most vampires' thoughts. When Edward eventually encountered other immortals and could read their minds as easily as he read human minds, Carlyle's internal voice matched his external voice in ways that suggested genuine integrity and genuine commitment to the principles he espoused, rather than suggesting performance or suggesting self-deception about his true nature and his true motivations. He thought about helping humans and thought about minimizing harm and thought about maintaining his soul, even though vampires were supposedly soulless creatures damned by their transformation and excluded from salvation regardless of how they chose to live their immortal existence. His faith was genuine even though it was complicated by his vampire nature, his belief in God and in redemption coexisting with his acceptance that he might be condemned despite his best efforts to live according to moral code that honored human life and that rejected the predatory nature that transformation had given him. Edward's early years as vampire were spent learning control and learning to hunt animals rather than hunting humans, whose thoughts he could hear screaming in terror as predator approached, and whose final moments he would experience telepathically if he chose to drink from them and to end their lives for the sake of satisfying thirst that burned in his throat constantly during newborn phase, when control was difficult and when bloodlust was strong enough to overcome rational thought and ethical conviction. Carlyle taught him technique and taught him philosophy. The practical skills of tracking and killing animals combined with a moral framework that justified the vegetarian choice and that explained why choosing a harder path was worth the sacrifice and worth the constant slight hunger that animal blood never quite satisfied in the way that human blood would satisfy if Edward allowed himself to taste what his body was designed to consume. The mountain lions became his preferred prey because their blood was richer and was more satisfying than deer blood or elk blood, the predator's diet providing something closer to human blood, though still fundamentally different and still fundamentally less complete than what his vampire nature craved, with intensity that never fully disappeared even as control improved, and even as years of practice made resisting the temptation easier through habit rather than through genuine elimination of desire. The 1920s passed in blur of adjustment and learning. Edward's newborn strength gradually fading into normal vampire capabilities and his control over his thirst gradually improving until hunting trips could be spaced further apart and until exposure to human scent no longer triggered automatic predatory response that required conscious effort to suppress. But the mind-reading gift never became easier to manage and never became less intrusive, despite Edward's hope that perhaps he would develop ability to block out unwanted thoughts or ability to focus only on specific minds, rather than hearing everyone within range broadcasting their internal monologues, whether Edward wanted to hear them or not. The constant noise of human consciousness became background static that Edward learned to partially ignore, but could never completely shut out. The awareness of others' thoughts shaping every interaction and preventing the kind of natural spontaneous connection that normal people took for granted when they engaged with others without knowing the hidden thoughts and hidden judgments that Edward could never escape or avoid. The isolation this created was profound and was permanent. Edward's awareness that he would never experience genuine surprise in conversation and would never experience genuine mystery in relationship, making him resign to loneliness that seemed like inevitable consequence of gift that was simultaneously advantage and punishment. 1927 brought the crisis that had been building since Edward's transformation. His resentment of the restrictions and his resentment of the constant denial of his nature finally overwhelming the gratitude he felt toward Carlyle for saving his life and the respect he felt for Carlyle's moral convictions about how vampires should choose to exist. The mind reading had shown Edward the darkness in human thoughts, and had shown him the casual cruelty and the casual selfishness that most people carried beneath their civilized exteriors, the knowledge making it easier to justify abandoning the vegetarian lifestyle and easier to justify taking what his vampire nature wanted without guilt about ending human lives that seemed less valuable and less worthy of protection when Edward knew the ugly truths about how humans actually thought and actually behaved when they believed no one was watching or listening. He left Carlyle without confrontation and without explanation, beyond brief conversation, where he announced his intention to live independently and to make his own choices about how to feed and how to exist as vampire without the constraints that Carlyle's philosophy imposed on those who chose to follow it. The years from 1927 through 1931 were spent hunting humans, but hunting selectively, according to rules that Edward created to justify the killing and to distinguish himself from common murderers who killed indiscriminately without regard to the worth or the crimes of their victims. He read minds and identified those whose thoughts revealed them as criminals or as abusers or as people planning violence against innocence, his telepathy providing certainty about guilt that human justice systems could never achieve through trials and through evidence that could be manipulated or misinterpreted. He stalked rapists and stalked murderers and stalked those whose internal monologues revealed intentions to commit terrible acts. His intervention preventing future crimes while satisfying his thirst and while allowing him to maintain fiction that he was not simply predator but was vigilante performing service by removing dangerous humans from populations they threatened. The thoughts of wife-beaters in bars were particularly easy to read, their intentions toward their families clear and their histories of violence evident in how they thought about their wives and children as possessions to control rather than as people to love. Edward's judgment of their worthiness swift and absolute, as he followed them home and ended their lives before they could inflict more damage on families who would be safer and happier without them. But the satisfaction was hollow, and the justification was transparent even to Edward himself when he examined his motivations honestly rather than accepting the rationalizations that made the killing easier to perform without completely surrendering to the monster that transformation had created. The thrill he felt when hunting was predatory thrill, not moral satisfaction. The pleasure in the chase and the pleasure in the kill coming from vampire instincts, not from righteous conviction that he was serving justice or serving greater good. The thoughts of his victims in their final moments haunted him, despite his attempts to focus only on the crimes they had committed or had planned to commit. Their fear and their pain and their desperate desire to live, creating echoes that persisted after the blood was drained and after the bodies were disposed of in ways that would not lead to discovery or to investigation. He was killing humans, and he was monster regardless of how carefully he selected his prey or how thoroughly he convinced himself that his victims deserved death more than random humans would deserve death if he simply fed indiscriminately as most vampires did, without bothering to create elaborate moral frameworks to justify natural predatory behavior. The growing self-loathing became unbearable as the years passed and as the body count accumulated, each kill adding weight to burden he carried and adding evidence that he was damned and was irredeemable and was exactly the soulless creature that vampire lore claimed all of his kind were, regardless of what choices they made or what philosophies they adopted to make their existences bearable. The return to Carlisle in 1931 was humbling and was difficult. Edward's pride making the admission of failure painful and making the request for forgiveness feel like surrender rather than like growth or like genuine moral development. But Carlisle accepted him without judgment and without triumph, his thoughts revealing only relief and joy that Edward had returned, and that the prodigal son had recognized the emptiness of the path he had chosen, and had chosen instead to return to the harder path that Carlisle walked, and that offered no satisfaction beyond the knowledge that human lives were being preserved, rather than being ended for the sake of vampire convenience. Edward resumed the vegetarian lifestyle with renewed commitment born from experience rather than from obedience, his years of hunting humans having taught him that killing did not satisfy the deeper hunger and did not fill the emptiness that had driven him away from Carlisle's guidance in the first place. The animal blood tasted worse than he remembered after years of human blood. The comparison unavoidable, and the sacrifice more apparent now that he knew exactly what he was giving up by choosing Carlisle's way. But the choice felt necessary and felt right in ways that the vigilante killing had never felt right, despite all the rationalizations and despite all the carefully constructed justifications. Esme Platt had joined Carlisle during Edward's absence. Her transformation in 1921, following her suicide attempt after the death of her infant son, and following the years of abuse from husband, who had nearly destroyed her spirit before grief over losing her baby, had pushed her to jump from cliff in an attempt to end pain that human existence had become. Carlisle had found her broken body and had transformed her rather than allowing her to die. His decision made partly from his old attraction to her, from when he had treated her as human patient years before, and partly from his loneliness and his desire for companion, who would share his existence and would share his philosophy about how immortal life should be lived. Esme loved Carlyle completely, and obviously her thoughts filled with devotion and with gratitude and with genuine affection that had developed from initial dependency into mature partnership, where both vampires contributed equally and where both vampires found in each other what they had lacked during their solitary existences before transformation had brought them together. Edward's relationship with Esme developed into something maternal despite their similar physical ages, her gentle nature and her nurturing instincts creating dynamic where she treated him as son and where he accepted her care without resentment because her thoughts revealed genuine love rather than revealing obligation or performance. Rosalie Hale's arrival in 1933 created immediate tension and created immediate disappointment. Carlyle, having transformed her after finding her dying from assault in Rochester, and having hoped that her extraordinary beauty and her intelligence would attract Edward and would provide him with mate who would anchor him to family and would give him reason to embrace vampire existence rather than merely enduring it. But Rosalie's thoughts from the moment she awakened were filled with bitterness and were filled with resentment of transformation that she had not chosen and had not wanted. Her grief about losing her humanity and losing her chance at motherhood and losing everything she had valued about her human existence, making her hostile toward everyone, including toward Edward, whose mind reading she experienced as invasion and whose presence she experienced as reminder of the vampire nature she despised and wished to reject, even though rejection was impossible when transformation was permanent and irreversible. Edward heard every thought of Rosalie's hatred and heard every complaint and heard every moment of her grief, the mind reading forcing him to experience her pain constantly whenever they were in proximity and forcing him to acknowledge that she found him as unattractive personally as he found her physically beautiful but emotionally incompatible. Emmett McCarthy's transformation in 1935 brought balance to household dynamics and brought Rosalie the mate she needed, even though she had not known she needed anyone and had not wanted companionship, when her focus was entirely on mourning what she had lost rather than on building what she might gain through immortal existence. Edward heard Emmett's thoughts from the moment he awakened and found them refreshing and found them simple in the best possible way. Emmett's uncomplicated joy at being vampire and Emmett's immediate devotion to Rosalie, creating positive presence in household that had been dominated by Carlyle's serious philosophy and Rosalie's bitter grief and Edward's intellectual melancholy. Alice Brandon and Jasper Whitlock arrived in 1950, bringing the Cullen family to its final composition. Alice's visions having shown her where she belonged, and Jasper's need for redemption, after decades of violence finding home in Carlyle's philosophy, and in Alice's unwavering faith that he could choose differently than his past had prepared him to choose. Edward heard Alice's chaotic thoughts jumping between present and future, and heard Jasper's guilt-ridden memories of the newborn armies and the lives he had taken. Both new family members adding complexity and adding depth to the household that would become Edward's permanent home across the decades that followed. The years from 1950 through 2003 passed in repetitive cycles of high school and relocation. Edward perfecting his performance of humanity, while growing increasingly convinced that love was impossible for someone like him, someone too damaged and too aware and too monstrous beneath the civilized surface to deserve the happiness his family members had found in their pairings. Every human girl's thoughts confirmed his conviction. Their attraction based purely on his appearance and never on actual knowledge of who he was or what he was beneath the beautiful mask that vampire transformation had given him. He resigned himself to eternal solitude, believing it was punishment he deserved for the lives he had taken during his rebellious years and for the monster nature he could control but could never eliminate. No matter how many centuries passed, or how perfectly he maintained the vegetarian lifestyle that marked him as different from most vampires, but that could not make him actually good or actually worthy of redemption that his soul might no longer be capable of receiving. January of 2005 began like every other January Edward had experienced across 87 years of vampire existence. The return to Forks High School after winter break, representing another semester of pretending to be 17-year-old human student learning subjects he had mastered decades before and engaging in social rituals that held no meaning and no interest beyond their utility in maintaining the cover story that allowed the Cullens to remain in Forks without attracting unwanted attention or unwanted questions about their true nature. The routine was comfortable in its predictability, each day unfolding according to patterns Edward could anticipate through decades of experience and through his ability to read the thoughts of teachers and classmates whose mental lives held no surprises and no mysteries after months of exposure to their repetitive concerns and their shallow preoccupations with grades and social hierarchies and romantic dramas that seemed important to them, but that Edward knew were temporary and would be forgotten within years of graduation when real life began and high school concerns faded into embarrassing memories. The first day back was unremarkable until second period biology class, when Edward was sitting at his assigned lab table reviewing material he had learned, when the subject was still called natural philosophy, and when modern cellular biology was unknown to science that had not yet discovered DNA or understood genetic mechanisms that Edward now studied in textbooks that presented information he found elementary and obvious. He was not paying attention to the classroom door or to the students entering because he could hear their thoughts announcing their arrivals, and because nothing about their mental chatter suggested anything worth his attention or worth interrupting his meditation on whether this semester might finally be the semester when he convinced Carlyle to let him skip high school entirely and pursue something more challenging or more interesting than repeating adolescence for the 1,000th time across the decades since his transformation. The wind shifted and brought scent through the open door that hit Edward with physical force, the smell triggering immediate reaction that he had not experienced in his 87 years of vampire existence, and that he had not believed was possible after decades of perfect control and decades of exposure to human blood without incident or without dangerous loss of restraint. The scent was not simply appealing or simply tempting in the way that all human blood was tempting to vampires whose natural diet was human and whose vegetarian lifestyle required constant denial of instincts that transformation had embedded in their biology and in their reflexive responses to prey. This scent was something else entirely, something that bypassed rational thought and bypassed conscious control and went directly to the predatory core of his vampire nature and demanded that he act and demanded that he hunt and demanded that he take what was being offered through the simple fact of this human's existence in his proximity. The burn in his throat was immediate and was excruciating, the venom pooling in his mouth automatically as his body prepared to bite and to drink and drain the source of that scent that was calling to him with intensity that made every other human scent seem pale and seem insignificant by comparison. His hands gripped the edge of the lab table with force that would have shattered human bones, the black composite material creaking under the pressure as he fought against the instinct to turn his head and to look at the source and to begin the hunt that every cell in his body was screaming for him to initiate, regardless of the consequences and regardless of the witnesses and regardless of everything he had built across decades of maintaining perfect control and perfect integration into human society. The monster inside was fully awake and fully focused. The rational Edward, who valued human life and who chose not to kill, reduced to small voice trying desperately to maintain control against overwhelming biological imperative that was demanding he abandon reason and abandon morality and simply take what his vampire nature had identified as the most desirable prey he would ever encounter in eternity of existence. He turned his head despite knowing he should not look, despite knowing that seeing her would make the temptation worse and would make resistance harder, when visual confirmation combined with scent to create complete sensory experience of prey whose blood was singing to him in ways that folklore described, but that Edward had never believed were literal until this moment when he understood that the singer phenomenon was real and was terrible and was going to destroy either his control or the human girl who had just entered his biology class without knowing that she had just walked into presence of predator who wanted her blood more than he had ever wanted anything in nearly 9 decades of existence. She was ordinary by human standards, her appearance unremarkable compared to Rosalie's supernatural beauty, or even compared to the prettier human girls who attended Forks High School and who attracted attention through conventional attractiveness that followed standard patterns of symmetry and proportion and coloring that human aesthetic preferences favored. Brown hair that was neither particularly long nor particularly short. Brown eyes that were neither particularly large nor particularly distinctive. Pale skin that was common in Forks where sunlight was rare and where most residents shared similar complexions, adapted to the perpetual cloud cover that made the Olympic Peninsula hospitable to vampires who could move freely during daytime hours without risking exposure through sparkling skin that sunlight would reveal. But her ordinariness made the intensity of his reaction more shocking and more disturbing because there was no rational explanation for why this particular human should smell better than any other human, when her appearance suggested nothing special and nothing that would justify the biological response that was threatening to overwhelm his control and threatening to turn him into killer in classroom full of witnesses who would see and would report and would destroy the Cullen family's carefully maintained cover in Forks. Edward heard the teacher's thoughts directing Isabella Swan to the empty seat next to Edward at the lab table they would share for the semester. The internal groan in Mr. Banner's mind about having to integrate new student mid-year mixing with his observation that at least she would be sitting with Edward Cullen, who was a good student and who would help her catch up on the material she had missed during first semester. The walk from door to table seemed to take hours, though Edward's vampire perception knew it was only seconds, each step bringing her closer and bringing the scent stronger and making the burn in his throat intensify until he thought he might lose control entirely and might lunge across the short distance and might sink his teeth into her throat before conscious thought could stop him, or before witnesses could react to prevent the attack. She sat down next to him, and he stopped breathing entirely. The only defense against scent that was pouring off her in waves, and that was filling the space around their shared table, and that would drive him insane if he continued to allow it into his system through normal respiration, that vampires did not actually need for survival, but that maintained appearance of humanity, and that prevented the unnatural stillness that would mark him as different and would mark him as wrong to observant humans who might notice that he never breathed and might wonder why. His mind was working frantically on multiple levels simultaneously. The rational part trying to maintain control while the predatory part was calculating angles of attack and calculating how quickly he could kill her and kill the witnesses before anyone could escape the classroom or could alert authorities. He could see it perfectly in his imagination. The route from his seat to the door that he could block before anyone reached it. The efficient way he could disable each student and teacher to prevent escape. The method of killing that would be quickest and would minimize his exposure to the scent that was already driving him toward madness, despite his desperate attempts to maintain the control that had never failed him in decades of practice. The visions of slaughter were detailed and were vivid. Edward's mind playing out each scenario with perfect clarity and with complete awareness of exactly how he would move and exactly how he would kill and exactly how satisfying her blood would taste when he finally allowed himself to drink after killing everyone who stood between him and the complete indulgence of the thirst that was consuming every thought and every instinct. He could see himself breaking Mr. Banner's neck first, because the teacher was closest to the door and would be first obstacle to securing the room, then moving through the students in efficient pattern that would prevent any of them from reaching windows or reaching the door before he had eliminated all potential witnesses to what he was about to do to Isabella Swan, whose blood he would save for last, so that he could take his time and could savor every drop of the vintage that nature had created specifically for him and for no other vampire in existence. But beneath the monster's planning was the horror of what he was contemplating. The rational Edward recognizing that he was seriously considering murdering 23 innocent people, including the girl whose only crime was existing and being unfortunate enough to sit next to Predator in biology class on ordinary January day, when she should have been safe and should have been able to attend school without fearing for her life. The self-loathing that had characterized his existence since his transformation intensified into absolute certainty that he was damned and was irredeemable and was exactly the monster that he had always feared he was beneath the civilized performance and beneath the decades of choosing not to kill when choosing to kill, would have been easier and would have been more satisfying to the vampire nature that transformation had given him, whether he wanted it or not. He sat frozen through the entire 55-minute class period, not breathing and not moving and not responding to Mr. Banner's attempts to introduce him to Isabella Swan, whose existence he was trying desperately to ignore, even though ignoring her was impossible when her scent was surrounding him, and when her presence next to him was all he could think about, despite his best efforts to focus on anything else. He watched the clock with intensity that would have seemed bizarre to anyone who noticed, each minute passing with agonizing slowness, while he maintained his grip on the table edge and maintained his refusal to breathe and maintained the internal war between the part of him that wanted to kill everyone in the room and the part of him that was horrified by wanting to kill everyone in the room. The other students' thoughts washed over him as background noise, Mike Newton's immediate attraction to the new girl registering distantly as Mike's mental voice began composing compliments and began planning how to ask her to sit with him at lunch. Jessica Stanley's assessment of Isabella as potential threat or potential friend, depending on whether she proved popular enough to matter in the school's social hierarchy. Edward heard all their thoughts about her, but could not hear her thoughts at all. The realization penetrating through the thirst and through the predatory focus to create new mystery and new source of fascination beyond the simple biological attraction of her scent. Her mind was completely silent to his telepathy. The void where her thoughts should be creating absence that was almost loud in its completeness when he was accustomed to hearing everyone's mental chatter, and when silence from human mind was unprecedented in his experience and was impossible according to everything he understood about his gift and about how it worked. He had encountered mental shields before in his 87 years. Bella's future daughter would possess one, and other vampires had demonstrated abilities that blocked or limited his telepathy. But he had never encountered human whose mind was simply absent from his awareness, as though she did not have thoughts at all, or as though her consciousness existed in frequency. He could not access despite being able to access every other human mind he had ever encountered. The bell ringing to end class was the most beautiful sound Edward had heard in decades. The signal that he could escape and could leave the classroom and could put distance between himself and the girl whose scent and whose silent mind had combined to create temptation and mystery that threatened everything he had built and everything he had maintained across nearly 9 decades of vampire existence. He left without speaking to her and without acknowledging her presence, his speed carefully controlled to remain within human parameters despite his desperate desire to simply run at full vampire speed away from the school and away from Fawkes and away from Isabella Swan, who represented danger to his control and danger to his family's security in ways that no human had ever represented before. He went directly to the front office and requested schedule change. His carefully constructed excuse about switching out of biology falling apart when the secretary's thoughts revealed that every other science class was full and that no changes were possible mid-semester without administrative approval that would require explanations Edward could not provide without revealing that his reason for wanting to switch was that he wanted to murder his lab partner and needed to avoid her to prevent that outcome. The drive to Carlisle's office at Fawkes Hospital took minutes that felt like hours. Edward's hands gripping the steering wheel with force that dented the metal as he drove faster than he should have driven on the wet roads and faster than human reflexes would have made safe, but that his vampire coordination made manageable despite the recklessness. He burst into Carlisle's office without knocking and without caring that Carlisle was reviewing patient charts and was not expecting interruption. The desperation in Edward's expression and the wildness in his eyes communicating the severity of the situation before Edward spoke and before Edward explained through rushed words about the scent and about the temptation, and about the serious consideration he had given to murdering an entire classroom full of innocent people for the sake of drinking one girl's blood. Carlyle's response was measured and was compassionate, his thoughts revealing concern for Edward and concern for the unknown girl, but also revealing confidence that Edward's control was stronger than Edward believed it was, and that the crisis would pass if Edward simply gave himself distance and gave himself time to process what had happened and to develop strategies for managing the temptation when he returned to school. But Edward could not imagine returning to biology class and could not imagine sitting next to Isabella Swan day after day while fighting the constant urge to kill her, the prospect seeming impossible and seeming like torture that he should not be expected to endure, when leaving Fawkes would solve the problem and would remove the temptation and would protect both her and him from the monster he became in her presence. The suggestion of leaving Fawkes was met with resistance from Carlyle, whose thoughts revealed his unwillingness to uproot the family again so soon after their arrival, and whose commitment to helping Edward develop better control outweighed his sympathy for Edward's suffering. The compromise was temporary retreat, Edward leaving for Alaska immediately to stay with the Denali coven for a week or perhaps 2 weeks, while he regained his equilibrium and while he decided whether he could return to Fawkes and face Isabella Swan without endangering her, or whether the family would need to relocate to protect everyone involved from Edward's lack of control around one specific human, whose blood sang to him in ways that made resistance feel impossible despite decades of practice and despite his commitment to Carlyle's vegetarian philosophy. The drive to Alaska was long and was lonely, Edward's thoughts circling endlessly around the scent and around the silent mind and around the horror of how close he had come to becoming mass murderer for the sake of satisfying thirst that should have been manageable after 87 years of controlling it perfectly around countless humans whose blood had tempted him but had never tempted him beyond his ability to resist. Tanya Denali welcomed him with warmth that had romantic undertones, her thoughts revealing continued attraction to him, despite his repeated rejections of her advances across the decades they had known each other, and despite his clear disinterest in pursuing relationship with her or with any of her sisters who had also expressed interest at various times. When Edward's perpetual solitude had seemed like problem, they could solve through offering him companionship and offering him the physical intimacy that vampire matings typically included. But Edward found no comfort in Tanya's company and found no distraction in the Denali sisters' attempts to entertain him or to draw him out of the brooding silence that characterized his stay in Alaska. His mind remained fixed on Isabella Swan and on the mystery of her silent mind, and on the question of whether he was strong enough to return to Fawkes, or whether running away was the only option that would keep her safe from him and would keep him from becoming the monster he had always feared he was. Beneath a surface control that apparently was not as reliable as he had believed it was, when faced with true temptation and with true test of whether decades of practice had actually changed his nature, or had simply allowed him to avoid situations where his nature would be revealed as fundamentally predatory and fundamentally dangerous regardless of how many years he spent pretending otherwise. The week in Alaska stretched into interminable existence, where each hour felt longer than entire years had felt during Edward's previous decades of immortality. the time passing slowly because his mind would not release its fixation on Isabella Swan and would not stop circling around the questions that her existence had created and that distance could not answer or resolve. Tanya's thoughts grew increasingly concerned as the days passed and as Edward remained withdrawn and remained completely unresponsive to her attempts at conversation or her attempts at distraction through hunting trips or through the social gatherings that the Denali Coven enjoyed and that normally provided pleasant respite from the isolation that vegetarian vampires experienced when living among their own kind, represented the only social contact that did not require constant pretense and constant performance of humanity. Carmen and Eleazar were kind and were understanding, their thoughts revealing sympathy for whatever crisis had driven Edward to seek refuge with them, even though he would not explain the specific circumstances or the specific human whose scent had triggered the flight from Forks that seemed excessive and seemed uncharacteristic for vampire whose control had always been exemplary and whose decades of vegetarian practice had made him one of the most disciplined members of their extended family group. Kate and Irina were less sympathetic and more curious, their thoughts speculating about what could possibly drive Edward from his family and from the comfortable existence the Cullens had established in Forks that seemed ideal for their purposes and their needs. The speculation irritated Edward, whose telepathy meant he could not escape their theories or their judgments, even when he isolated himself in guest room and tried to focus on anything other than the memory of scent that haunted him and the memory of silent mind that fascinated him in ways that were distinct from the biological attraction and that created entirely separate motivation for wanting to return to Forks despite the danger and despite the rational understanding that staying away was safer for everyone involved. The absence of her thoughts in his awareness had created void that felt almost physical. The silence where her mental voice should be creating hunger that was different from thirst, but was equally compelling and was equally difficult to ignore when Edward had spent 87 years swimming in the constant noise of human consciousness and had never experienced the peace and the frustration of encountering mind that was genuinely closed to him. After 5 days in Alaska, Edward made his decision, the choice crystallizing through combination of factors that included his refusal to allow one human girl to drive him away from his family and his refusal to accept that his control was so weak that simple proximity to tempting scent would inevitably lead to murder despite decades of evidence that he could resist human blood when he chose to resist it. The rationalization that he was strong enough and that the initial shock had been manageable and that subsequent exposures would be easier as he adapted to her particular scent helped justify the decision, even though Edward knew he was also motivated by the mystery of her silent mind and by the desire to understand why she was different and why she, alone among billions of humans, possessed consciousness that his telepathy could not penetrate or access. Carlyle's thoughts when Edward called to announce his return revealed a mixture of relief and concern. The relief at having Edward back with the family balanced by concern about whether Edward was truly ready to face the temptation again, or whether pride was driving premature return that might end in disaster and might end in exposure or worse if Edward's control failed and if Isabella Swan died, because Edward had overestimated his ability to resist her blood. The return to Forks High School after 1 week of absence happened on Monday morning when Edward entered the campus and immediately caught her scent on the wind, the smell triggering the same burn in his throat and the same venom pooling in his mouth, but not triggering the same desperate planning of mass murder that had characterized his first exposure to her presence. The adaptation was real, even if it was incomplete. Edward's ability to remain rational and remain in control despite the thirst proving that proximity to Isabella Swan would not inevitably lead to her death, or to the deaths of witnesses who would need to be eliminated to cover the crime. He could manage this, he told himself, as he walked toward the school building where she would be somewhere inside attending her classes and existing in complete ignorance of the danger that her existence represented, and the danger that Edward represented to her fragile human life. Biology class second period brought them face to face again. After the week of separation, Edward entering the classroom with careful control of his breathing and careful control of his expression to prevent any visible sign of the struggle happening internally as he fought against instinct and fought to maintain the civilized behavior that the situation required. He sat down at their shared lab table and turned to face her with apology, prepared and with determination to behave normally despite the abnormal intensity of his reaction to everything about her, from her scent to her silent mind to her brown eyes that watched him with wariness that suggested she had noticed his strange behavior during their first encounter and had drawn conclusions that might be dangerously close to truth if she was observant enough and intelligent enough to recognize the predatory nature beneath his beautiful exterior. The words came more easily than he had anticipated. The simple greeting and the simple apology for his rude behavior the previous week flowing naturally despite the thirst and despite the constant awareness of her pulse beating beneath her pale skin and of her blood flowing through her veins just inches away from where he sat, pretending to be human teenager, interested in nothing more threatening than completing the lab assignment that Mr. Banner had written on the board. Her response was cautious and was polite, her voice pleasant, and her manner suggesting she was willing to accept the apology and willing to move forward without dwelling on the strangeness of their first meeting when Edward had acted like her presence was physically painful to him and when he had fled the classroom as though she carried contagious disease that he desperately needed to avoid. The silence of her mind remained absolute and remained maddening. Edward's attempts to hear her thoughts meeting the same void and the same complete absence of mental voice that should have been broadcasting her reactions and her assessments and her private judgments about him and about the situation. Everyone else in the classroom was thinking loudly and thinking constantly. Mike Newton's jealous thoughts about Edward sitting next to Bella, particularly annoying in their presumptuous possessiveness toward girl Mike had known for barely 1 week, but had already decided he wanted to date and wanted to claim as girlfriend before any other boy in school could successfully pursue her. Jessica Stanley's thoughts were calculating and were catty. Her assessment of whether Bella would prove to be competition for male attention, or whether Bella's plain appearance would keep her safely in background, where Jessica preferred potential rivals to remain, so that Jessica's own bid for popularity and for romantic success would not be threatened. Angela Weber's thoughts were kind and were genuine. Her observation that Edward and Bella made striking pairs sitting together at the lab table coming from a place of aesthetic appreciation rather than from jealousy or from malice. Her internal voice noting that Edward's unusual beauty was somehow complemented by Bella's ordinariness in a way that created interesting visual contrast. Edward heard all of these thoughts and dozens more from the students surrounding them, but he could not hear Bella's thoughts and could not know whether she found him attractive or found him strange or found him frightening or found him completely unremarkable. Beyond the superficial beauty that all vampires possessed and that served biological purpose of attracting prey through supernatural loveliness that overcame human caution. The conversation between them developed haltingly as Edward asked questions designed to provoke responses that might reveal her thoughts indirectly through her words, since he could not access them directly through his telepathy. He asked whether she liked forks, and whether she missed Phoenix, and whether the rain bothered her. The mundane questions serving dual purpose of establishing normal social interaction and gathering information about this girl whose silent mind had become obsession and whose presence had disrupted his existence in ways that no human had ever disrupted it, despite the thousands of humans he had encountered across 87 years. Her answers were careful and were measured, her words chosen with precision that suggested intelligence and suggested awareness that he was studying her more intently than normal lab partner would study new classmate during second week of acquaintance. But Edward made mistakes because the mind reading had become such integral part of his existence that he sometimes forgot that normal people could not hear thoughts and could not know things that had not been spoken aloud. He answered questions she had not asked verbally, and he responded to thoughts she had not voiced, and he revealed knowledge he should not possess about her preferences and her habits. The slips creating confusion that showed on her face and that showed in the way she looked at him with increasing suspicion, an increasing certainty that something about him was wrong, even if she could not identify exactly what was wrong, or exactly why his behavior seemed off in ways that went beyond simple social awkwardness or simple eccentricity. She asked him directly how he knew things she had not told him. Her question simple and her tone more curious than accusatory, but the question itself revealed that she was observant and was paying attention in ways that most humans did not pay attention when interacting with the Cullens, whose beauty distracted from the small inconsistencies and the small impossibilities that careful observer might notice if they looked past the surface appearance and examined the behavior and the knowledge that did not quite align with what normal humans would know or would be able to do. Edward deflected, and Edward lied, his excuses weak but his delivery smooth enough that she seemed to accept them, or at least seemed to decide not to push further when pushing might create confrontation or might reveal answers she was not ready to hear. The following weeks of January and early February brought daily exposure to Bella Swan in biology class and brought daily struggle against the thirst that never fully disappeared, but that became more manageable as Edward's system adapted to her scent, and as his control strengthened through repeated practice of sitting next to her and breathing carefully and maintaining conversation while fighting constant awareness of her vulnerability and her proximity. He began to enjoy their conversations despite the danger and despite the constant underlying temptation to bite her and to drain her and to satisfy the singer craving that her blood triggered in him uniquely among all humans he had ever encountered. Her intelligence became apparent through their discussions, her observations about the material they studied revealing mind that was analytical and was thoughtful in ways that high school curriculum rarely demanded or rarely revealed in students who were primarily focused on grades rather than on actual understanding. The mystery of her silent mind deepened rather than resolving as weeks passed, and as Edward's exposure to her increased, without bringing any progress toward understanding why she was immune to his telepathy, or what made her different from every other human, whose thoughts he could read effortlessly regardless of their intelligence, or their education, or their mental discipline. He began to theorize that perhaps she possessed natural shields similar to what some vampires possessed after transformation, the rare gift that blocked mental intrusion and that protected consciousness from being read or being manipulated by telepathic abilities like Edward's, or by other mental gifts that some vampires developed after their transformations amplified whatever talents they had possessed as humans. But the shield theory did not fully explain the attraction he felt toward her that went beyond the biological craving for her blood, and that included genuine interest in her personality and genuine enjoyment of her company, despite the danger and despite the constant fight against instinct. She was different from other humans in ways that had nothing to do with her scent or her silent mind, her self-deprecating humor and her intelligent observations and her complete lack of vanity about her appearance, creating personality that Edward found refreshing after decades of human girls, whose thoughts reveal shallow preoccupations and whose interest in him was based entirely on his physical beauty, rather than on any actual knowledge of who he was beneath the surface. The habit of watching her sleep began in early February, when Edward's obsession with understanding her had grown beyond what classroom conversations could satisfy, and when his rationalization that he was protecting her from dangers she faced through her remarkable clumsiness became excuse for behavior that he knew was stalking, even as he refused to name it as such. He climbed through her bedroom window after midnight when Charlie Swan was asleep downstairs and when Bella was alone and vulnerable, in ways that should have made Edward's presence in her room predatory and should have made his observation of her sleeping form disturbing rather than romantic. But Edward convinced himself that his intentions were protective and that his presence was justified by the need to ensure her safety from the various dangers that seemed to find her, despite Forks being small town, where crime was rare and where teenage girls should have been safe in their own beds, in their own homes. She talked in her sleep, but her words were fragments and were unclear, the sleeping mind apparently no more accessible to his telepathy than her waking mind had been when he sat next to her in biology class, trying desperately to hear even single thought that would explain her and would explain why she was different. She said his name once during the second week of his nightly visits, the word emerging from her sleeping lips with context he could not determine, and with meaning he could not interpret when the sentence around it was mumbled too quietly for even his vampire hearing to distinguish clearly. The sound of his name in her voice created feelings that Edward had not experienced in 87 years of existence. The combination of pleasure and terror and possessiveness mixing with the ever-present thirst to create emotional complexity that he did not know how to process and did not know how to reconcile with his conviction that he was damned and was unworthy of love and was dangerous to anyone who got close to him. Charlie's thoughts were readable from downstairs, where the police chief slept and where his parental concerns about his daughter manifested in dreams that Edward could access through Charlie's sleeping mind, even though Bella's sleeping mind remained as silent as her waking mind. Charlie worried about Bella's adjustment to Fawkes and worried about whether moving here had been a mistake, and worried about the distant relationship they had developed during her childhood when she had lived with Renee in Phoenix, and when Charlie had been weekend father and summer father, rather than full-time parent with daily involvement in her life. The love was genuine, even if the expression was awkward. Charlie's masculine reticence and his lack of experience with teenage girls, making him uncertain about how to connect with daughter who had become a stranger during the years of separation and who was now living in his house and requiring his care and his guidance, even though he had no confidence in his ability to provide what she needed. The photographs in Bella's room told story of her childhood in Phoenix with Renee. The images showing younger Bella in various stages of growing up and showing Renee, who appeared more like sister than mother in many of the photos, where her youthful appearance and her casual manner suggested friendship rather than suggesting traditional parent-child relationship. Edward studied the photos during the long hours of watching Bella sleep, his vampire vision allowing him to examine details that human eyes would miss in the darkness, and allowing him to construct understanding of her history and her relationships from the visual evidence scattered around her room in the form of photographs and books, and the few personal items she had brought with her from Phoenix to this rainy town she clearly did not want to be in. The books on her shelves revealed literary tastes that were more sophisticated than most teenagers displayed. The classics like Wuthering Heights and Pride and Prejudice sitting alongside Shakespeare and Bronte in collection that suggested genuine love of reading rather than suggesting completion of assigned school reading that most students approached as chore rather than as pleasure. Edward recognized kindred spirit in her choice of literature, his own centuries of reading having given him appreciation for books that explored human nature and human relationships with depth and with honesty that modern popular fiction rarely attempted. The classic authors understanding tragedy and understanding complexity in ways that contemporary writers seem to avoid in favor of simple narratives and simple resolutions that did not reflect actual human experience. The growing attachment he felt toward Bella Swan terrified Edward more than the thirst terrified him. The emotional investment creating vulnerability that he had avoided successfully for 8 decades by refusing to allow anyone close enough to matter, and by maintaining careful distance from humans whose lives were temporary and whose relationships with him could only end in loss when their mortality claimed them, and when he remained unchanged and remained alone. But Bella was different, and Bella was special, and Bella's silent mind created mystery that Edward could not resist trying to solve, even when solving it meant spending more time with her and meant allowing the attachment to deepen, and meant accepting that he was falling in love with human girl, whose blood he craved and whose life he endangered simply through his presence in her world. The conflict between wanting to protect her and wanting to possess her created constant internal war that characterized every interaction and characterized every moment Edward spent in her presence or in her bedroom watching her sleep, while fighting the dual temptations of biting her throat and of allowing himself to love her, despite knowing that love between vampire and human was dangerous and was doomed, and was fundamentally wrong when the power imbalance and the nature difference made genuine equality impossible and made the relationship inherently predatory, regardless of his intentions or his careful control. The evening of the Port Angeles trip in late February began with Edward having no intention of following Bella to the city, where she was planning to shop for dresses with Jessica Stanley and Angela Weber. His rational mind recognizing that stalking her to Port Angeles would cross line from protective observation into genuine obsession and into behavior that could not be justified through any rationalization about keeping her safe from dangers that probably did not exist beyond his own imagination. But Jessica's thoughts during lunch period revealed the plan and revealed the timing and revealed that Bella would be alone for a period of time, while Jessica and Angela browsed in stores that Bella found uninteresting. The mental image of Bella wandering Port Angeles streets by herself, triggering alarm that Edward could not ignore and could not rationalize away, despite knowing that his concern was excessive and was probably rooted more in his desire to be near her than in any legitimate threat to her safety. He followed them in his Volvo, keeping careful distance behind Jessica's car and using his ability to track Jessica's thoughts to monitor their progress without needing to maintain visual contact that might alert them to his presence if they happened to notice the same silver car appearing repeatedly in their rearview mirror. The drive to Port Angeles took 90 minutes through winding roads and through small towns that dotted the Olympic Peninsula between Forks and the larger city, where more shopping options existed than Forks could provide, and where teenage girls from small towns went when they needed dresses for school dances or when they wanted to feel sophisticated and urban for afternoon away from the claustrophobic familiarity of communities where everyone knew everyone and where privacy was impossible and where escape from small-town life required actual physical departure to somewhere larger and more anonymous. Jessica's thoughts during the drive were focused on her hope that Bella would help her choose dress that would make Mike Newton notice her and would make him forget his obvious attraction to Bella, who Jessica resented for attracting male attention, without seeming to try and without seeming to care about the social dynamics that Jessica found all-consuming and found critically important to her happiness and her status. Angela's thoughts were gentler and were more focused on finding dress that would please her and would make her feel pretty without bankrupting the modest budget that her family's finances required her to maintain when shopping for non-essential items like formal dresses for school dances. Bella's thoughts remained silent and remained inaccessible, her mental voice absent from the chorus of human consciousness that Edward monitored constantly and that provided him with more information than he wanted about the trivial concerns and the shallow preoccupations that characterize most human thinking. They separated in Port Angeles as Jessica's earlier thoughts had predicted, Bella declining to continue shopping after the first store failed to yield acceptable dress options, and after the second store proved equally disappointing, her decision to explore bookstore instead of continuing the dress hunt, making Jessica mentally relieved because Bella's presence had been making the shopping less fun and had been making Jessica self-conscious about her choices, when Bella's obvious disinterest in fashion made Jessica's enthusiasm seem shallow and seem silly. Edward tracked Bella's movement through the city by following the minds of people who noticed her passing. The trail of human thoughts about the quiet girl with brown hair creating breadcrumb path that Edward could follow even when he could not see her directly, and even when distance made tracking her scent impossible among all the other human scents that fill the city streets. But the trail went cold when Bella apparently wandered into area where fewer pedestrians travelled and where human thoughts became sparse and became less frequent. The gaps in Edward's ability to track her through others' minds creating anxiety that intensified into panic when he realized he had lost her location and had no way to find her, except through systematic searching of the streets where she might be walking. He drove through Port Angeles with increasing desperation, his careful control over his speed abandoning him as he pushed the Volvo faster than was safe and faster than was legal through the city streets, while his mind raced through worst-case scenarios and through images of Bella injured or Bella lost, or Bella in danger that he should have prevented by not allowing her to wander alone in unfamiliar city. The thoughts he found were not Bella's thoughts because her mind remained forever silent, but they were thoughts about a girl who matched her description, and they were thoughts that made Edward's hands tighten on the steering wheel until the metal groaned under the pressure and until his vampire strength dented the leather wrapping. 4 men whose minds were filled with casual cruelty and with predatory intent had spotted Bella walking alone and had decided to follow her and had decided to corner her and had decided to do things that their thoughts described in detail that made Edward's vision tinge red with rage that exceeded anything he had felt since his years of hunting criminals and since his years of reading the thoughts of men who hurt women and who believed their violence was justified or was deserved or was simply entertainment without consequences. He found them in alley where they had maneuvered Bella through casual conversation and through deliberate blocking of her escape routes, their thoughts confident and their manner relaxed because they had done this before and because they believed that young girl alone would not resist and would not fight and would not escape from 4 grown men who were larger and stronger and who had advantage of numbers and advantage of experience with violence that their victim would not possess. Edward's Volvo screeched to halt between Bella and her attackers, the sudden appearance of the car in the narrow alley startling the men, whose thoughts shifted instantly from predatory confidence to confusion and then to fear as they recognized that their prey was no longer alone and was no longer vulnerable to their plans. His voice, when he spoke to Bella, was barely controlled. The words, "Get in the car," emerging through clenched teeth as he fought against the overwhelming urge to leave her in the Volvo and to return to the alley and to kill all 4 men in ways that would satisfy the rage and would satisfy the protective fury that their thoughts about Bella had triggered in him. Their intentions had been clear and had been detailed. The images in their minds of what they had planned to do to her creating murderous certainty in Edward that these men deserved death and deserved the kind of death that would involve suffering and would involve terror that matched the terror they had been planning to inflict on innocent girl whose only mistake had been walking alone in wrong part of city at wrong time. Bella's hand on his arm was light and was warm, the touch penetrating through the rage and through the bloodlust that was different from thirst, but was equally consuming and was equally difficult to resist when every instinct was screaming at him to protect her through eliminating the threat permanently and thoroughly. Her voice saying, "Don't go back," was quiet but was firm, her tone suggesting that she knew exactly what he was contemplating and exactly what he wanted to do, and that she was asking him to choose her presence over his vengeance, even though vengeance would be justified and would be righteous, and would prevent these men from hurting other women in the future when they recovered from the fear and recovered from the interrupted attack and returned to their predatory habits. The choice between monster and man was made in the moment when he decided to honor her request instead of following his instinct. The decision to drive away from the alley instead of circling back to kill the men representing victory for the part of him that valued her opinion and valued her wishes more than he valued satisfying the rage that was still burning in his chest and still demanding that he return and finish what instinct had started. He drove to restaurant without asking where she wanted to go. His assumption that she would need food and would need normal human activity to process what had almost happened, overriding any consideration of whether she might want to return immediately to Jessica and Angela, who were probably wondering where she was and probably worrying about her absence. The conversation over dinner was careful and was loaded with unspoken questions that Bella was clearly formulating, but was not yet ready to ask directly, her eyes watching him with intensity that suggested she was analyzing and was cataloguing every detail about his behavior and about his impossible knowledge of her location and about his impossible arrival at exactly the right moment to prevent the attack that should have happened, because Edward should not have known where she was or should not have known she was in danger. He deflected her questions and he avoided direct answers, his responses designed to satisfy her curiosity enough to prevent immediate confrontation, while not revealing so much that she would learn the truth about what he was and about why he had been in Port Angeles at all, when he should have been in Forks and should have had no reason to know she needed help. But his control over the conversation was imperfect because his emotions were still turbulent from the near attack and from the choice he had made not to kill the men who had threatened her. The anger bleeding through his carefully constructed calm and making him say things that were more honest than strategic, and making him admit to following her when admission revealed the depth of his obsession and revealed the extent to which he had been monitoring her movements and inserting himself into her life without her knowledge or her consent. She did not react with fear or with anger as he had expected, her response instead revealing acceptance that seemed inappropriate, given what he had just admitted, and given what his stalking should have communicated about his character and his respect for her privacy and her autonomy. The drive home from Port Angeles gave Bella opportunity to ask the questions that had been building since his rescue and since his admission that he had followed her to the city, her directness catching Edward unprepared, because most humans approach difficult topics through circumlocution and through careful phrasing that allowed retreat if the conversation became uncomfortable. She asked him what he was with bluntness that left no room for evasion, her tone suggesting she had theories and had conclusions, but wanted confirmation rather than wanting to remain in uncertainty about the boy who could move impossibly fast and who could find her impossibly accurately and who seemed impossibly strong, when she had felt his arm stopping her from hitting the pavement during the parking lot incident weeks earlier. Edward's response was a mixture of truth and deflection. His description of himself as the world's most dangerous predator accurate, but vague enough to avoid explicit confirmation of vampire nature that he knew he should not reveal and knew he should protect through lies and through denials, regardless of how much he wanted to be honest with her. Her theory, when she finally voiced it, was simple and was direct. The single word vampire hanging in the air between them with weight that made Edward's unnecessary breathing stop entirely as he processed that she knew and that she had figured it out despite his careful performance of humanity and despite the absurdity of vampires existing in a world where rational people did not believe in monsters or in supernatural creatures that belonged in fiction rather than in reality. His non-answer was answer enough, the silence confirming what his words could not confirm without violating the fundamental rule that vampires maintained about secrecy and about never revealing their nature to humans who might expose them or who might spread knowledge that would endanger vampire society and would bring attention from humans who would hunt them or would study them or would destroy the careful balance that allowed vampires to exist hidden among their prey. But Bella did not seem interested in exposing him or in spreading knowledge. Her questions instead focused on understanding him and understanding how his abilities worked and understanding why he had saved her, when saving her required revealing himself and required risking everything he had built with his family in Forks. The confession of his telepathy came more easily than Edward had anticipated. The relief of finally explaining to someone why he seemed to know things he should not know, and why he sometimes answered questions that had not been asked, outweighing the danger of revealing yet another impossible thing about himself that marked him as different and marked him as supernatural creature rather than as normal teenage boy. Her mind's silence became topic of conversation when Edward admitted that he could hear everyone's thoughts except hers. The frustration and the fascination that her immunity created in him apparent in how he described the void where her mental voice should be, and how he described the unprecedented nature of encountering human whose consciousness was completely inaccessible to his gift. The meadow invitation came spontaneously when Edward decided that if she knew what he was, then she deserved to see what he was completely and entirely, without the careful editing and the careful concealment that he maintained around humans who did not know his true nature. The following Saturday, he brought her to his favorite meadow where sunlight occasionally penetrated the usual cloud cover, and where he could show her the sparkling skin that sunlight revealed and that marked him unmistakably as something other than human, regardless of how perfect his performance might be in shadows and in artificial light. Her reaction to seeing him sparkle in the sunlight was awe rather than horror, her expression showing wonder rather than showing revulsion when she saw the diamond-like glittering that covered every inch of his exposed skin, and that made him look like living sculpture made of crystal and of light, rather than looking like monster or looking like creature that should inspire fear. He told her he was monster, and he told her she should be afraid, and he told her that being with him was dangerous and was potentially deadly because his thirst for her blood had not disappeared and had not diminished despite weeks of exposure and despite his growing love for her that made the thought of harming her unbearable, but did not make harming her impossible, if his control failed, or if circumstances aligned in ways that pushed him past the limits of his restraint. The lion and lamb conversation emerged naturally from his attempts to warn her away, and from his attempts to make her understand that predator and prey could not have relationship that was safe or that was sustainable when fundamental nature made him danger to her, regardless of his intentions or his feelings. But she refused to be frightened, and she refused to maintain appropriate distance, her hand reaching for his face, and a touch breaking through his final resistance to admitting that he loved her and that he wanted her and that he would try to be with her, despite knowing that trying was dangerous and was probably doomed, but was impossible to resist when she was willing and when she was brave enough to love Monster, who loved her back with intensity that terrified him and thrilled him and made him believe that perhaps redemption was possible, and that perhaps he was not entirely damned if someone as good and as pure as Bella Swan could see past the monster and could love the man beneath. The weeks following the Meadow confession transformed Edward's existence in ways that 87 years of vampire life had not prepared him for and had not suggested were possible. When he had resigned himself to eternal solitude and to eternal observation of happiness that others experienced, but that he believed was forever beyond his reach. Being with Bella meant constant vigilance and constant battle against instincts that hadn't diminished despite his growing love for her and despite his absolute commitment to protecting her from all threats, including the threat that he himself represented through his nature and through the thirst that her scent triggered. With unchanged intensity, every single time he breathed near her or touched her or allowed himself to be close enough that her warmth radiated against his cold skin. Every moment together required careful calculation and careful control. The simple act of sitting next to her in biology class or holding her hand during walks through the forest, demanding concentration that would have exhausted human, but that Edward maintained through vampire focus and through desperate determination, not to be the monster who killed the girl he loved because his control had failed, or because one moment of weakness had overcome decades of discipline and had allowed instinct to triumph over conscious choice. He learned to breathe through his mouth instead of through his nose when proximity made her scent overwhelming, the technique reducing the intensity of her smell and reducing the venom pooling in his mouth, but not eliminating the constant awareness of her blood flowing beneath her skin, just inches away from his teeth and just seconds away from satisfying the singer craving that nature had designed specifically to make certain humans irresistible to certain vampires. The distance he maintained was always calculated and was always deliberate. His positioning of himself in relation to her body, following patterns that maximized his ability to react if control slipped, and that minimized the temptation that came from touching her skin or from being close enough that her pulse was visible in her throat, where the artery carried blood that called to him with a voice that was louder than any human voice and was more compelling than any conscious thought. He never allowed himself to be directly above her or directly behind her, where predatory instinct would be strongest and where attack position would be most natural if the monster inside decided to override the man who loved her and who had chosen to resist despite the cost and despite the constant burning need that characterized every second of their relationship. Her fragility was apparent in everything she did and everything she was. The human weakness that transformation had eliminated from Edward's existence, now visible in ways that made him hyper-aware of how easily she could be damaged and how easily she could be killed, either through his intentional violence or through simple accident, when vampire strength made normal human interactions dangerous if he forgot himself, or if he moved too quickly, or if he held her too tightly in moments when emotion overcame careful control. She tripped over nothing, and she bruised from minor impacts, and she bled from small cuts that would be invisible to vampire whose skin was impervious to normal damage, and whose body healed instantly from anything short of being torn apart and burned. The dramatic difference between their respective durabilities, creating constant anxiety about hurting her accidentally through simple carelessness or through momentary lapse in the constant vigilance that their relationship required from him. Reading everyone else's thoughts about their relationship provided Edward with more information than he wanted about how others perceived them and about what others believed about their connection. The mental commentary ranging from envious to suspicious to disapproving, depending on whose mind he was reading, and depending on what assumptions they were making about why beautiful Edward Cullen was dating plain Bella Swan, when he could have dated anyone, and when his choice made no sense according to the social hierarchies that governed high school relationships and that dictated who belonged with whom based on appearance and popularity. Mike Newton's jealous thoughts were particularly tedious and were particularly persistent, his mental voice constantly circling around the question of what Bella saw in Edward and what Edward saw in Bella, and why Mike's own pursuit of her had failed when he had been kind to her, and had been friendly to her, and had done everything the teenage courtship ritual suggested should make girl interested in boy who was showing interest. Jessica Stanley's resentment manifested in catty observations about how Bella must have some secret appeal that was not visible to Jessica's assessment, and about how Edward must have strange tastes if he preferred ordinary Bella to the prettier girls who would have dated him eagerly if he had shown any interest in them. Angela Weber's thoughts were gentler and were more supportive. Her genuine happiness for Bella's relationship with Edward, based on observation that they seemed genuinely happy together and seemed to share connection that transcended the superficial attractions that characterize most high school romances, where relationships formed and dissolved based on social pressures and based on physical attraction without deeper compatibility or deeper understanding. Charlie Swan's thoughts were a complicated mixture of suspicion and resignation. His parental concern about his daughter dating boy he did not know well enough to trust warring with his recognition that Bella was nearly adult and was capable of making her own choices about relationships, even if those choices made Charlie uncomfortable, or made him worry about whether Edward was appropriate boyfriend for daughter, whose happiness mattered more to Charlie than his own comfort or his own preferences. The police chief's professional instincts made him wary of Edward in ways that Charlie could not articulate, but that manifested in thoughts about running background checks and about investigating the Cullen family more thoroughly to ensure that they were what they claimed to be, and that Edward was safe companion for Bella, whose previous lack of dating experience made Charlie worry that she might not recognize warning signs or might not protect herself adequately from potential dangers. Carlyle's thoughts revealed worry balanced with hope. his concern about Edward's ability to maintain control around Bella's constant presence in Edward's life mixed with his genuine happiness that Edward had finally found someone who made him want to engage with existence rather than simply enduring it through the repetitive patterns that had characterized his previous decades. Carlyle worried about exposure and worried about whether the relationship could end in anything other than tragedy when Bella would age and Edward would not, or when Bella would die and Edward would continue existing without her. The inevitable conclusions to human and vampire relationship, creating problems that Carlyle had contemplated across his centuries but had never solved in ways that allowed both parties to remain happy and remain together indefinitely. Esme's thoughts were purely supportive and purely joyful, her maternal love for Edward making her celebrate his happiness without reservation and without the concerns that Carlyle's more analytical mind could not avoid contemplating. She thought about wedding planning and thought about welcoming Bella into the family permanently, and thought about the grandchildren she would never have, but had learned to accept she would never have when vampire nature made biological reproduction impossible for creatures whose bodies were frozen and unchanging. Her hopes for Edward's happiness were genuine and were uncomplicated by the practical concerns that should have tempered her enthusiasm, but that her loving nature refused to acknowledge when acknowledging them would diminish the joy she felt at seeing her son finally experiencing love and finally believing that he deserved happiness despite his vampire nature. Rosalie's fury was constant and was loud, her thoughts screaming opposition to Edward's relationship with Bella and screaming warnings about the danger and about the stupidity of involving human in their lives when humans were fragile and were temporary and were fundamentally incompatible with vampire existence that required secrecy and required isolation from normal human society. She thought about the risk to their family and thought about the potential exposure if Bella proved untrustworthy, or if Bella revealed their secret intentionally or accidentally to other humans who would investigate and who would discover the truth that would force the Cullens to flee Forks and to abandon the comfortable existence they had established. Her resentment was personal and was philosophical, her own grief about losing humanity making her unable to understand why Edward would involve himself with human when he could simply wait for vampire mate, who would be appropriate partner and who would not require the constant careful control that Bella required. Emmett's thoughts were amused and were supportive, his simple nature finding entertainment in watching Edward navigate relationship complexities and finding genuine happiness in seeing his brother experience emotions that Emmett had experienced with Rosalie, and that he believed everyone deserved to experience, regardless of species or regardless of complications. He thought about teasing Edward and thought about offering advice that Edward would probably ignore, but that Emmett would offer anyway, because offering advice was what brothers did, and because Emmett's own successful relationship with Rosalie made him feel qualified to comment on romance despite the dramatic differences between his situation and Edward's situation. Alice's visions were constantly shifting and constantly changing as decisions were made and as futures branched into different possibilities depending on choices that had not yet been finalized and depending on events that had not yet occurred. Edward saw through Alice's mind the various potential outcomes of his relationship with Bella, some visions showing them happy together and showing Bella transformed into vampire, who would spend eternity with Edward as his mate and as his equal. Other visions showing tragedy and showing Bella's death through accident or through Edward's loss of control or through external threats that neither of them could prevent despite their best efforts and despite their love. Jasper's thoughts revealed his constant struggle with Bella's presence whenever she visited the Cullen house. His newest vegetarian status making him more vulnerable to bloodlust than the other family members whose decades or centuries of practice had given them control that Jasper had not yet fully developed, despite his commitment to the lifestyle and despite his genuine efforts to resist human blood. Edward heard Jasper's internal battle every time Bella was near, the desire to attack warring with the determination not to disappoint Alice and not to destroy the family's trust by proving himself incapable of controlling instincts that his years in the Southern Vampire Wars had trained him to indulge rather than to resist. The empathic ability made Jasper aware of Edward's own struggle with thirst, the constant low-level desire that Edward maintained careful control over bleeding into the emotional atmosphere around them and creating feedback loop where Jasper felt Edward's thirst and Edward felt Jasper's thirst, and both vampires had to work harder to maintain control when their gifts made them aware of each other's struggles. The normalcy that Edward craved manifested in simple domestic activities that he had observed across decades but had never participated in, when those activities required human companion and required relationship that Edward had never believed he could have. Cooking for Bella became ritual that Esme helped orchestrate, the preparation of human food in kitchen that vampires never used for their own needs, creating illusion of domesticity, and creating moments when Edward could pretend that he was normal boyfriend, doing normal things for normal girlfriend, who needed sustenance and who appreciated the effort, even when the results were imperfect. Because Edward's lack of ability to taste food made him dependent on recipes and on Esme's guidance, rather than on his own judgment about seasoning or cooking time. Watching Bella eat was fascinating in ways that Edward had not anticipated. The simple act of human consumption revealing biological processes that vampires no longer performed, and revealing vulnerability that made Edward simultaneously protective and hungry. When watching her swallow made him think about her throat and about the blood flowing through arteries that were visible when she tilted her head certain ways. He learned to look away during meals and learned to focus on her face instead of focusing on her throat, where pulse was visible and where scent was strongest, when blood was closest to surface during digestion and during the increased circulation that eating triggered in human cardiovascular system. The baseball game invitation came from Alice, whose visions had shown that Storm would provide cover for their game, and that Bella's presence as umpire would be safe and would be enjoyable for everyone involved in the family activity that Bella had expressed interest in witnessing. When Edward had explained vampire baseball and had explained that they could only play during thunderstorms when the sound of their bats hitting balls would be masked by thunder, and when their superhuman abilities could be displayed without risk of human observers noticing impossible speed or impossible strength. Edward's agreement to bring Bella to the game was reluctant and was calculated. His assessment that exposing her to all his family members simultaneously while they were displaying their full vampire abilities represented risk, but represented manageable risk when the alternative was disappointing her and was denying her the opportunity to see him in his element doing activity he genuinely enjoyed, without the constant restraint that human society required. The preparation for the baseball game involved explaining rules and explaining vampire modifications to standard baseball that made the game playable for creatures whose speed and strength exceeded human capabilities by orders of magnitude that would make normal baseball field too small and would make normal baseball rules inadequate for competition between players who could hit balls hundreds of yards and who could run bases in fractions of seconds. Bella's excitement was visible in her expression and was audible in her voice when she asked questions about how they played and about what positions they preferred and about whether she would actually be able to see them move or whether their speed would make them invisible to human perception that could not track motion beyond certain velocity threshold. Edward's own excitement about sharing this aspect of his life with Bella surprised him with its intensity. The anticipation of showing her what he could do without restraint, and showing her the joy he took in physical activity that allowed him to use his abilities, fully creating happiness that had been absent from his existence for longer than he could remember, when most activities were performed at human speed and were performed with human limitations that made vampire capabilities irrelevant and made vampire nature something to hide rather than something to celebrate. The thought that she would watch him play and would see him as he truly was without the careful performance of humanity, creating vulnerability that terrified him, but that also thrilled him, when her acceptance of his vampire nature suggested that she might accept all aspects of what he was, including the predatory joy he took in competition and in physical challenge that human limitations would never provide. The domesticity and the normalcy and the simple happiness of being with Bella created cognitive dissonance with a constant awareness that he was monster and that she was prey, and that their relationship violated fundamental rules about predator and prey relationships that nature had established, and that vampire society recognized as absolute when humans were food and were not partners, regardless of what individual vampires might feel about individual humans. But Edward chose to ignore the impossibility and chose to embrace the happiness, despite knowing that happiness built on such fragile foundation could not last and could not survive the inevitable challenges that would come from external threats or from internal failures when his control was tested beyond its limits, and when love might not be sufficient to prevent tragedy that seemed increasingly inevitable the longer their relationship continued, and the more deeply he fell in love with a girl whose blood he craved and whose life he treasured, in ways that were contradictory and were unsustainable, but were undeniable and were absolute. The baseball game in late March began with the joy and the freedom that Edward had anticipated. The clearing in the forest, providing adequate space for vampire baseball and the approaching storm, providing acoustic cover for the sounds that would be impossibly loud to human ears, but that would blend with thunder in ways that made the game possible without attracting attention from hikers or from residents of nearby towns who might investigate strange noises coming from the usually quiet Olympic wilderness. Bella's presence as umpire was delightful and was amusing. Her human perspective on their superhuman speed, creating commentary that made the family laugh and made the game more entertaining when her reactions reminded them how impossible they appeared to normal observers who had never witnessed vampire abilities, and who had no framework for understanding how fast they could move or how hard they could hit the baseball that would have been destroyed instantly if it were normal baseball, rather than being specially reinforced ball that could withstand the forces that vampire strength generated. Edward's enjoyment of playing without restraint while Bella watched was profound and was simple. The physical activity providing release and providing joy that had been absent from his recent existence, when every moment with Bella required careful control and required conscious limitation of his abilities to maintain human pretense. Here in the clearing with his family and with Bella safely positioned away from the action, he could run at full speed and could hit with full strength and could display the capabilities that transformation had given him without worrying about exposure or about accidentally revealing his nature to observers who would be frightened or who would be dangerous if they learned the truth about what the Cullens were beneath their beautiful human disguises. Alice's sudden vision interrupted the game mid-play, her body freezing in outfield position as her consciousness shifted from present to future, and as her mind showed Edward through his telepathy the images that were forming in her precognitive awareness. 3 vampires were approaching the clearing, nomads whose thoughts Alice could not read directly, but whose decisions she could see through the outcomes those decisions would create in the immediate future. The vision showed their arrival in minutes rather than hours, the timing too close to allow for Bella's removal from the clearing before the nomads would emerge from the forest and would see the Cullens and would want to investigate what appeared to be coven of vampires playing baseball during storm in territory that nomads might consider available for hunting or for temporary residence. Edward's immediate instinct was to take Bella and run, to remove her from the clearing before the nomads arrived and before they could see her or smell her or become aware that the Cullens were associating with human whose presence would seem strange and would seem like violation of normal vampire behavior when humans were food and were not companions. But Alice's vision showed that running would not work, the timing too tight and the nomad's trajectory too direct to allow escape before visual contact would occur. Carlyle's thoughts were racing through options and through strategies, his centuries of experience with nomad encounters providing framework for how to handle situations diplomatically and how to minimize potential conflict when 3 unknown vampires met 7 Cullens who had territorial claim to Forks area and who had established residence that nomads were expected to respect according to vampire customs that were not laws, but were generally observed courtesies between covens. The decision was made to stay and to introduce themselves normally, to treat the encounter as chance meeting between vampires who shared territory temporarily and who would exchange pleasantries before the nomads moved on to their own hunting grounds and to their own concerns. Bella would need to stay close to Edward and would need to remain silent, her humanity hopefully not immediately apparent if the wind did not shift and if her scent did not reach the nomads before introductions were complete, and before the Cullens could establish that she was under their protection and was not available as prey, regardless of how appealing her scent might be to vampires who were passing through. The 3 nomads emerged from the forest with casual confidence that suggested they were accustomed to traveling together and were comfortable with encountering other vampires without expecting hostility or expecting territorial challenges. Laurent was the speaker and was the diplomatic one. his thoughts revealing French origins and centuries of vampire existence that had taught him how to navigate encounters with unknown covens, and how to assess situations before committing to courses of action that might prove dangerous or might prove beneficial, depending on the nature of the vampires he was meeting. Victoria was cautious and was calculating. Her thoughts focused on escape routes and on threat assessment as she evaluated the Cullen's numbers and evaluated their apparent cohesion as family unit that might defend each other if conflict arose. James was the tracker and was the hunter. His thoughts immediately focused on the game itself, rather than on the vampires playing it. His centuries of hunting creating instinctive interest in any challenge and instinctive evaluation of any potential prey that crossed his awareness. The introductions proceeded normally with Carlyle representing the Cullens and with Laurent representing the nomads. The exchange of names and the exchange of territories following standard patterns that Edward had witnessed dozens of times across his decades when nomads passed through areas where the Cullens were residing. Laurent's thoughts revealed that the nomads were heading north toward Canada and were simply passing through the Olympic Peninsula without intention of establishing permanent residence or of challenging the Cullens' claim to Forks and to the surrounding hunting territory. Victoria's thoughts remained wary but remained non-hostile. Her assessment that the Cullens outnumbered the nomads making conflict unwise and making peaceful departure the sensible choice once pleasantries were exchanged. But the wind shifted and carried Bella's scent directly to the three nomads whose reactions were immediate and were visceral. James's head snapping toward where Bella stood next to Edward, and James's thoughts shifting instantly from polite interest in meeting fellow vampires to predatory focus on human, whose scent was extraordinary and whose presence was impossible to ignore once the wind had revealed her existence. Edward heard James's thoughts and heard the hunter's instant recognition that this human was special and that her scent was appealing in ways that normal human scent was not appealing even to vampires who preferred human blood over animal blood. The tracker's mind began calculating immediately the angles of approach and the speed required to reach her, and the obstacles represented by the 7 Cullens, who had positioned themselves protectively around the human creating challenge that James found irresistible and found exciting in ways that normal hunting never excited him, when normal prey offered no real difficulty and no real contest. Edward's protective stance was instantaneous and was absolute, his body moving between Bella and James before conscious thought directed the movement and before strategy could be formulated beyond the simple imperative to protect her from threat that James represented through his thoughts and through his predatory focus that had locked onto Bella as target and as prize worth pursuing, regardless of obstacles or regardless of consequences. The family surrounded Bella in coordinated formation that their decades together had made automatic, each vampire knowing their role and knowing their position without needing verbal communication or needing Carlyle's direction when threat was obvious and when response was unanimous. Laurent's thoughts revealed his alarm at the situation and his desire to diffuse the tension before it escalated into violence that would serve no one's interests and that would create problems for his small coven when the Cullens had numbers advantage and had home territory advantage. He spoke diplomatically about moving on and about respecting the Cullens' claim to the human. his words designed to give James excuse to back down without losing face and without admitting defeat in confrontation that had not yet become actual conflict. Victoria's thoughts were focused entirely on James and on reading his intentions. Her loyalty to her mate absolute, but her survival instincts making her calculate whether his interest in the human was worth fighting 7 vampires who were clearly prepared to defend their companion. James's thoughts revealed that he had accepted the challenge and had decided to pursue Bella regardless of the obstacles and regardless of the Cullen's protection. The hunter's nature making him unable to resist prey that promised difficulty and promised satisfaction that easy hunting never provided. Edward heard the decision forming in James's mind before James himself had fully articulated it. The tracker's centuries of experience creating almost unconscious assessment of how to separate Bella from her protectors and how to exploit weaknesses in their defensive formation and how to use time and distance to his advantage when immediate attack would fail, but patient stalking would eventually create opportunity. The nomad's departure was superficially peaceful, but was fundamentally threatening. Laurent's diplomatic words not matching James's predatory thoughts and not matching Victoria's calculating assessment of how to support her mate's hunt without directly confronting the Cullens in ways that would guarantee violence. Edward heard all of their thoughts as they withdrew into the forest. James's mind already planning and already strategizing about how to track Bella and how to separate her from Edward, whose protective instinct James had recognized and had decided to exploit by creating situations where Edward would be forced to choose between protecting Bella directly and protecting his family from James's attacks. The immediate strategy session after the nomad's departure was tense and was urgent. Carlyle's thoughts racing through options, while Emmett's thoughts focused on direct confrontation and on hunting James before James could hunt Bella. Jasper's military experience provided tactical assessment that hunting James would be difficult when James was legendary tracker, whose abilities exceeded normal vampire tracking, and whose centuries of successful hunts suggested he would be nearly impossible to catch if he chose to run rather than choosing to fight. Alice's visions were shifting constantly as decisions were made and as James's plans evolved, the future branching into multiple possibilities, depending on what actions the Cullens took and what responses James chose when he realized they were actively defending Bella, rather than simply warning him away. Edward's thoughts were singular and were desperate. His entire focus on protecting Bella from threat that he had inadvertently created by bringing her to baseball game and by exposing her to nomads who would never have known she existed if Edward had simply left her home, where she would have been safe from James's attention. The guilt was overwhelming and was consuming. Edward's self-recrimination mixing with his fear to create emotional state that made rational planning difficult when all he wanted was to take Bella somewhere James could never find her and to keep her safe through simple physical separation from the hunter, whose thoughts revealed absolute determination to complete the chase regardless of how long it took or how much effort it required. The plan that emerged from the family discussion involved splitting up to maximize confusion and to maximize the chances that James would follow Fool's trail, while Bella was moved to safety in location James could not predict and could not track. Alice and Jasper would take Bella to Phoenix where her mother lived and where James would have no reason to look for her when the obvious choice would be to hide her in Forks or to hide her somewhere in Washington where the Cullens had established territory. Edward and Emmett would lead James on False Trail away from Bella's actual location, the hope being that James would follow Edward's scent because James would recognize that Edward was Bella's primary protector and would assume that Edward would stay close to his mate rather than separating from her when separation made her more vulnerable. The separation from Bella was agony that Edward had not anticipated. His instinct to stay with her and to protect her directly warring with the rational understanding that leading James away was better protection than staying close when staying close would bring the tracker directly to her location. Bella's thoughts remained silent and remained inaccessible, her expression showing fear but also showing trust that Edward found simultaneously comforting and terrifying when that trust meant that she was relying on him to keep her safe and was relying on his plan to work when the plan involved leaving her with Alice and Jasper while Edward ran in opposite direction, hoping that James would follow. The goodbye at the Cullen house was brief and was inadequate. Edward's desire to say everything and to express everything he felt constrained by the urgency and constrained by the presence of his family, who were waiting and who were ready to execute the plan that required immediate action before James could get closer or could discover Bella's location through tracking or through simple observation of the Cullens' movements. He held her carefully and he breathed in her scent, knowing that it might be the last time if the plan failed or if James proved more clever than they anticipated. The possibility of her death creating hollow fear in his chest, where his heart no longer beat, but where emotion still resided despite the physical transformation that had stopped his biological functions. The run through the Olympic wilderness with Emmett was fast and was desperate. Edward's speed pushed to maximum as they laid False Trail, and as they attempted to make their scent strong enough that James would have no choice but to follow. When tracking vampire scent was easier than tracking human scent, and when Edward's scent would be connected to Bella's scent in ways that would make James believe that following Edward would lead to Bella eventually. Emmett's thoughts were focused and were supportive, his simpler nature finding the situation straightforward when the goal was clear and the method was clear, even if the outcome was uncertain. But Alice's frantic phone call hours into the run shattered the plan and shattered Edward's fragile hope that distance would keep Bella safe. Her vision showing James in ballet studio with Bella, whose presence there made no sense and whose danger was absolute, when Alice's vision showed violence and showed blood and showed outcome that Edward could not accept and could not allow to happen. The vision had come too late to prevent Bella from going to the studio. Alice's precognition only showing decisions after they were made, and only showing futures after they began to solidify through choices that had already occurred. The limitation of her gift meaning that she could warn, but could not prevent when events were already in motion. Edward's turn toward Phoenix was instantaneous, his speed increasing beyond what he had thought possible. As desperation overrode caution, and as fear overrode everything except the single imperative to reach Bella, before James killed her, or before James transformed her, or before James did whatever the vision had shown that Alice's thoughts were trying to hide from Edward to prevent him from losing control entirely. The drive from wherever they were to Phoenix would take hours even at vampire speed. the distance too great and the time too short when every second mattered, and when Bella's human fragility meant that minutes of violence could end her life permanently and irrevocably. Carlisle's thoughts tried to calm Edward from Carlisle's car that was also racing toward Phoenix. His mental voice urging Edward to stay focused and to stay rational when losing control would not help Bella and would not improve the situation. But Edward could not be calm and could not be rational when he could imagine too clearly what James was doing and what Bella was suffering. The tracker's thoughts from their brief encounter providing enough information about James's methods and James's preferences to construct horrible, detailed scenarios about how James was torturing her and how James was enjoying her fear before he would finally kill her and would finally end the hunt that had challenged him in ways that made the victory sweeter and made the prize more satisfying. The ballet studio, when Edward finally arrived, smelled overwhelmingly of Bella's blood, the scent that had haunted him since January now present. In quantities that should have driven him completely insane with thirst, but that instead drove him insane with rage and with terror, that she was dead or dying or suffering in ways that he should have prevented and should have protected her from through better planning or through better execution of the plan that had clearly failed catastrophically. The hospital days following the ballet studio disaster were characterized by Edward's constant presence at Bella's bedside and by his constant internal debate about whether staying in her life represented love or represented selfishness when his presence had nearly gotten her killed, and when James's attack had been direct consequence of Edward's decision to expose her to his world and to his family and to the dangers that vampire existence inevitably attracted. He watched her sleep in hospital bed surrounded by machines that monitored her heartbeat and her breathing and her vital signs that confirmed she was alive and was healing despite the injuries that James had inflicted during the minutes before Edward had arrived and had destroyed the tracker in rage that had been absolute and had been satisfying in ways that disturbed Edward when he examined his own reaction to killing and to the pleasure he had taken in tearing James apart while Bella lay broken on the ballet studio floor. Her recovery was remarkable by human standards. The resilience of her young body allowing healing that doctors found encouraging even when they did not fully understand how she had survived the fall through the window and the stairs that the cover story claimed had caused her injuries. Edward heard the doctors' thoughts about her case and heard their professional assessments that she was lucky to be alive and that her recovery timeline would be months rather than weeks, when the damage to her leg and the damage to her ribs suggested trauma that should have been more severe and should have resulted in complications that fortunately had not manifested. Carlisle's role as consulting physician allowed him to monitor her care and allowed him to ensure that medical treatment proceeded appropriately without revealing that her injuries had come from vampire attack rather than from accidental fall. Renee's arrival from Florida brought maternal concern and brought questions that Edward found difficult to answer when Bella's mother wanted to understand how her daughter had ended up in Phoenix when she was supposed to be in Forks, and wanted to understand why Bella had been alone in ballet studio, where Renee had once taken her for lessons years ago when Bella was child. The cover story held, despite Renee's suspicions, Bella's insistence that she had simply wanted to visit her old ballet studio and had simply been clumsy combining with Edward's performance of concerned boyfriend to create narrative that Renee accepted because alternative explanations would have required believing in possibilities that rational adult woman could not accept without evidence that Edward was careful to ensure did not exist. Charlie's drive from Forks took hours that Charlie spent thinking about his daughter and thinking about whether he had failed as father by allowing her to leave Forks without adequate supervision, and whether Edward was responsible somehow for the accident, even though Charlie could not articulate exactly how boyfriend could be blamed for girlfriend's clumsiness. Edward heard all of Charlie's thoughts during the police chief's visits to hospital, and heard all of Charlie's concerns about whether Bella should remain in Forks or whether she should return to Phoenix, where Renee could supervise her more closely, and where accidents apparently happened anyway, despite maternal presence. The conversations with Bella during her recovery turned repeatedly to the question of transformation and to Bella's insistence that she wanted to become vampire and wanted to spend eternity with Edward regardless of the cost and regardless of what she would lose through transformation that would end her humanity and would end her mortal life. Edward's refusal was consistent and was absolute. His position that she deserved human life and deserved human experiences unmoved by her arguments or by her pleas that she wanted to be with him forever, and that forever required transformation, because human lifespan was too short and would end too quickly. The fundamental disagreement created tension that neither of them could resolve. Bella's determination to become vampire meeting Edward's equally strong determination to preserve her humanity, creating impasse that would define their relationship and would create ongoing conflict that had no clear solution when both positions were based on love but were completely incompatible. Edward's private resolution to leave Bella was forming during the hospital days, even as he sat beside her and held her hand and pretended that everything would be fine once she healed and once they returned to Forks. The logic was clear and was undeniable in his mind. His presence endangered her and his world endangered her, and staying with her would inevitably lead to another James or another crisis that might end with her death rather than ending with her survival. The greater love was letting her go, despite how much leaving would hurt both of them. The sacrifice of his happiness, and her happiness justified by the preservation of her life and the preservation of her humanity, that she would eventually appreciate once the pain of separation faded, and once she moved on to normal human existence with normal human boyfriend, who would not attract trackers and would not require constant vigilance to prevent accidental death. Alice's visions of his departure plans showed her horrified futures where Bella sank into depression and where Bella engaged in reckless behavior that endangered her life in ways that were different from but potentially as lethal as vampire-related dangers that Edward was trying to protect her from. Edward blocked out Alice's mental protests and blocked out her attempts to show him the consequences of leaving, his certainty that leaving was right choice, overriding the evidence that leaving would devastate Bella and would potentially destroy her through grief that Alice's visions suggested would be profound and would be dangerous. The summer between the ballet studio attack and the start of senior year provided opportunity for Edward to plan his departure and to construct a scenario that would allow clean break without possibility of reconciliation, that would undermine the purpose of leaving. Carlisle's job offer in Los Angeles was convenient fiction that would explain the Cullen family's departure from Forks, the relocation plausible, and the timing reasonable, when Carlyle had only been at Fawkes Hospital for a few years, and when moving for better position was exactly the kind of career advancement that would make sense to human observers who had no reason to suspect supernatural motivations. But prom night in May represented final perfect memory that Edward wanted to give Bella before he left. The normal high school experience that she deserved and that he wanted her to have, despite her protest that she hated dancing and hated formal events and would prefer to skip prom entirely. Alice's insistence that Bella attend and Alice's vision that prom would be important combined with Edward's own desire to give Bella something beautiful and something normal before he destroyed everything through his departure, making the prom plan inevitable. Despite Bella's reluctance, and despite her suspicion that something was wrong, even when Edward performed happiness and performed normalcy. The tuxedo and the corsage and the limousine were traditional and were appropriate for prom date. Edward's attention to every detail creating evening that would be memorable and would be perfect in ways that Bella could look back on after he was gone and could remember without the pain and the trauma that characterized too many of their experiences together. Her dress was Alice's selection and was beautiful in its simplicity. The blue fabric complementing Bella's coloring and the style appropriate for 17-year-old attending high school prom with boyfriend who looked like he belonged in fashion magazine rather than in small-town high school gymnasium decorated with crepe paper and balloons. Dancing with her required careful support because her leg was still healing from the ballet studio injuries and because her natural clumsiness made dancing challenging even when she was healthy and uninjured. Edward held her carefully and moved them, both across the floor in patterns that looked like dancing, but that required him to do all the work while she simply held on and trusted him to keep her upright and keep her moving in ways that approximated normal prom dancing. The music and the lights and the other couples created atmosphere that was quintessentially high school and quintessentially human. The ritual of prom representing milestone that vampires never experienced and that Edward had observed dozens of times across his decades, but had never participated in, because participating required date and required willingness to engage with human social rituals in ways that Edward had always avoided, until Bella had made him want to participate and had made him want to give her normal experiences. The thoughts of their classmates surrounded them with noise that Edward could not block out. Mike Newton's bitter jealousy and Jessica Stanley's catty observations about Bella's dress and Angela Weber's genuine happiness for them, creating mental soundtrack that Edward barely noticed when his focus was entirely on Bella and on memorizing every detail of this evening that would be their last perfect memory together, before everything ended and before he left her to live the normal human life she deserved. The envy and the admiration and the confusion about why Edward Cullen was with Bella Swan had become familiar themes in the mental chatter that followed them everywhere. The social dynamics of high school making their relationship subject of speculation and subject of gossip that Edward found tedious, but that Bella seemed oblivious to, when her silent mind protected her from knowing what people really thought. Jacob Black's interruption came from the edge of the dance floor where Billy Black had sent his son with message that was thinly veiled warning about the treaty and about vampire presence in Forks that the Quileute tribe monitored. and that Billy wanted to remind Edward was tolerated only as long as Cullens maintained the agreement not to bite humans and not to come onto Quileute land. Edward heard Jacob's uncomfortable thoughts about delivering message he did not fully understand, and about interrupting prom date for what seemed like his father's paranoid concerns about old legends that Jacob did not believe and did not take seriously. The dismissal of the warning was polite but was firm. Edward's response designed to acknowledge Billy's concern without engaging in confrontation that would ruin Bella's prom experience and would create scene that other students would remember and would discuss. The final dance was slow and was intimate, the music creating moments where Edward could hold Bella close and could pretend that this was not ending, and could pretend that they had future together that extended beyond tonight and beyond the departure he had planned for the end of summer. Her request for transformation came again during the dance, her voice quiet but her determination clear when she asked him to change her and asked him to make her vampire so that they could be together forever without the constant awareness that her humanity made her fragile and made their relationship temporary. His refusal was gentle but was absolute. His words about wanting her to stay human and wanting her to experience life ringing hollow even to his own ears when both of them knew that staying human meant staying mortal and meant aging while he remained frozen at 17 and meant eventually dying while he continued existing without her. The lie embedded in his refusal was that he claimed to want her to have human experiences and have human life when the truth was that he wanted those things for her, but he also wanted to leave her before she could choose transformation and before she could sacrifice her humanity for relationship with him. The greater deception was pretending that they had time to discuss this and had time to figure out compromise when Edward had already decided that summer's end would bring his departure and would bring the end of their relationship regardless of what she wanted and regardless of what he wanted, when staying together seemed increasingly impossible. After James's attack had demonstrated the dangers and had demonstrated that loving her meant endangering her in ways that Edward could not accept and could not allow to continue. The drive home from prom was quiet and was loaded with unspoken words that Edward wanted to say, but could not say when saying them would reveal his plans and would prevent the clean break that leaving required. Bella's thoughts remained silent, but her expression showed contentment and showed happiness that made Edward's planned betrayal feel even worse when she trusted him and loved him, without knowing that he was already planning to abandon her for what he believed was her own good, and for what he believed was necessary protection, even though leaving would hurt her in ways that might prove as dangerous as staying when Alice's visions showed depression and showed recklessness that could end in Bella's death through different means than vampire attack would cause. The goodnight kiss was careful and was restrained. Edward's control over his desire for her blood and his desire for her body maintained through decades of practice, but tested by the knowledge that this might be one of the last times he would hold her, and one of the last times he would taste her lip, that were warm and soft and human in ways that made his cold marble skin seem even more unnatural and even more wrong when contrast between them was so stark and so obvious. He left her at Charlie's door and drove away slowly, despite wanting to stay and wanting to watch her sleep one more time through her bedroom window, the departure practice for the permanent departure that would come soon. and that would end everything they had built together across these months, that had been simultaneously the best and the worst of Edward's 87 years of existence. September the 13th of 2005 arrived with Edward's awareness that Bella was turning 18 years old and was officially becoming adult, while he remained frozen at 17 years old forever. The visual and chronological reminder of their fundamental incompatibility, creating tension that Edward had been trying to ignore throughout the summer months, when their relationship had continued despite his plans to leave and despite his growing conviction that staying with her was selfish and was dangerous. The age difference that had always existed but had seemed manageable when Bella was 17 now seemed significant and seemed wrong when she was legal adult, and he was perpetually adolescent vampire whose actual age of 87 years made the relationship even more inappropriate than simple appearance suggested. Alice's insistence on celebrating Bella's birthday with a party at the Cullen house was characteristic of Alice's enthusiasm for human rituals and for opportunities to treat Bella as family member, rather than as Edward's temporary human girlfriend, who would eventually be replaced or eventually be transformed depending on decisions that had not yet been made. Edward heard Alice's thoughts about the party planning and heard her visions of celebration that would be safe and would be happy. Her precognition showing no danger and showing no problems beyond Bella's expected embarrassment at being center of attention and at receiving gifts that she would protest, were unnecessary and were excessive. Edward's hesitation about the party was based partly on his knowledge that Bella disliked celebrations focused on herself, and partly on his instinct that gathering the entire family, including Jasper, whose control was still developing, created unnecessary risk. When Bella's presence in a house full of vampires represented temptation, even for those whose decades of vegetarian practice had made human blood resistible under normal circumstances. But Alice's confidence and Carlisle's approval and Esme's excitement about celebrating their first birthday with Bella in attendance overrode Edward's concerns, his reluctance seeming like excessive caution when the family had successfully hosted Bella multiple times without incident, and when Jasper had proven capable of controlling himself during previous visits despite the constant struggle that Edward heard in Jasper's thoughts. The Cullen house was decorated with care that Esme had supervised, and that Alice had executed with characteristic attention to detail. The streamers and the flowers and the carefully arranged presents creating festive atmosphere that would have been appropriate for a human birthday party. But that seemed slightly absurd when none of the vampires would eat the cake that sat as centerpiece on the table, and when the celebration was entirely for Bella's benefit, rather than being genuine, shared experience. Edward heard Esme's thoughts about wanting to make Bella feel welcomed and feel loved. The maternal instincts that transformation had not eliminated manifesting in Esme's careful planning, and in her genuine joy at having young person to celebrate and to nurture, even when that young person was human and was temporary presence in their immortal existence. Carlisle's thoughts revealed his genuine affection for Bella and his hope that she would choose transformation eventually and would become a permanent member of their family. His acceptance of her relationship with Edward more complete than Edward's own acceptance when Carlisle saw the happiness that Bella brought to Edward's existence and saw the positive changes in Edward's attitude and in Edward's engagement with life rather than simple endurance of immortal existence. Rosalie's thoughts were resentful and were hostile as always. Her presence at the party motivated by obligation rather than by desire, when she believed Bella's humanity should be preserved, and when she believed Edward's relationship with Bella was a mistake that would end badly and would potentially expose the family to danger or to unwanted attention. Emmett's thoughts were cheerful and were uncomplicated. His amusement at Edward's obvious devotion to Bella, mixing with his general enjoyment of family gatherings and his simple pleasure in seeing people happy even when the people included human, whose presence created complications and created tensions that Emmett chose to ignore in favor of focusing on positive aspects of situation. Jasper's thoughts were focused entirely on maintaining control and on resisting the constant temptation that Bella's scent created. His newest vegetarian status making every moment around her challenging and making the party attendance something he was enduring rather than enjoying. When his empathic ability meant he felt everyone's emotions in addition to feeling his own thirst and his own struggle. Bella's reluctance was visible in her expression and audible in her protest that she did not want party and did not want presents, and would have preferred to spend her birthday quietly with Edward rather than being celebrated by an entire vampire family who had gone to considerable trouble to create an event that Bella clearly did not want. Edward heard the family's thoughts reacting to her discomfort, Alice's slight disappointment that her careful planning was not producing the joy she had anticipated mixing with Esme's concern, that perhaps they had overwhelmed Bella with attention she was not comfortable receiving. The presents were opened with Bella's visible embarrassment. Edward's gift of plane tickets to visit Renee in Florida, designed to give her experiences with her mother before those experiences became impossible if she chose transformation and if she chose to become vampire, who could not safely visit human family members without risking exposure or risking loss of control. Alice's gift was stereo system for Bella's truck, the extravagance typical of Alice's approach to gift giving and typical of the Cullen family's wealth that made expensive presents seem normal when their resources were effectively unlimited and when money was tool rather than constraint. The wrapping paper was thick and was resistant. Bella's struggled to open the package, creating a moment of ordinary human difficulty that vampires never experience when their strength made opening anything effortless, and when their dexterity made fumbling impossible. The paper cut happened in an instant that changed everything. The small slice on Bella's finger producing single drop of blood that welled red against her pale skin, and that released scent into the room with intensity that Edward registered immediately as dangerous and as catastrophic when he heard Jasper's thoughts shift from control struggle to overwhelming hunger in a fraction of a second. Edward's protective response was automatic and was instantaneous, his body moving between Bella and Jasper before conscious thought directed the action and before strategy could be formulated beyond the simple imperative to protect her from a family member whose control had snapped and whose instinct had overridden decades of practice and months of successful resistance. The shove that Edward delivered to push Bella away from Jasper's lunge was too forceful and was poorly calculated in the emergency, his vampire strength sending her flying backward into the table where birthday cakes sat surrounded by glass plates that shattered when her body collided with them. the sound of breaking glass mixed with Bella's gasp of pain as sharp edges sliced into her arm. The small paper cut instantly insignificant compared to the larger wound that was now bleeding freely and was releasing scent that filled the room and that made every vampire present fight against instinct and fight against the biological imperative to feed when fresh human blood was abundant and was easily accessible. Jasper's attempt to reach Bella was blocked by Emmett, whose strength was sufficient to restrain even determined vampire whose bloodlust was fully triggered and whose rational mind was temporarily overridden by predatory instinct. Edward heard Jasper's thoughts fragmenting into incoherent need and into shame that was already forming beneath the hunger. The awareness that he was proving himself incapable and was proving himself dangerous, mixing with the overwhelming desire to bite and to drink and to satisfy the thirst that Bella's blood triggered with intensity that Jasper's limited vegetarian experience had not prepared him to resist. Alice's thoughts were horrified and were guilty, her visions having shown the party as safe and successful rather than showing the disaster that was unfolding. The failure of her precognition creating self-recrimination that Edward heard even as he focused on Bella, and on assessing her injuries, and on calculating whether he himself could maintain control when her blood was everywhere, and when the scent was filling his lungs, despite his attempts to breathe shallowly. Carlyle's response was professional and was calm, his centuries of medical practice allowing him to function around human blood without losing control, and allowing him to treat Bella's wounds with the efficiency and the skill that made him valuable doctor and made him capable of helping humans despite being vampire, whose nature should have made helping impossible when helping required proximity to bleeding patients. Edward heard Carlyle's thoughts focusing on the medical needs and on the treatment protocol. The clinical assessment of Bella's injuries, providing distraction from the scent, and providing framework for action that was constructive rather than destructive. Rosalie's thoughts were bitter and were triumphant in ugly way, her mental voice noting that this was exactly the kind of incident she had warned would happen, and exactly the kind of danger that Bella's presence created for family, whose control was excellent, but was not perfect when tested by circumstances that combined fresh blood with close quarters, and with vampire, whose vegetarian commitment was recent and was not yet fully developed. The satisfaction Rosalie felt at being proven right, mixed with genuine concern about family cohesion, and about whether Jasper's loss of control would create permanent damage to his confidence or to his place in the family, when his struggle was visible and was embarrassing in ways that would make recovery difficult. Edward's own control during the incident was barely maintained, and was constantly threatened by the scent that surrounded him and by the visual evidence of Bella's blood on her arm and on the floor and on the broken glass that had caused injuries that seemed minor, but that could have been catastrophic if the glass had hit major artery or if the fall had been worse. The thirst was present and was demanding, but was overridden by horror at what had happened and by guilt about causing her injuries through his protective shove that had been too forceful, and by the growing certainty that this incident was final evidence that his presence in her life was dangerous and was unsustainable, when even birthday party could turn into near tragedy that required Emmett's physical restraint of family member, and required Carlyle's medical intervention. The certainty that formed during those moments was absolute and was devastating. He had to leave her to protect her from himself, and to protect her from his world, and to protect her from the constant dangers that vampire existence attracted regardless of intentions or regardless of precautions. The pattern was undeniable when every major incident in their relationship had involved Bella being endangered by vampire-related threats, from James's attack to Jasper's loss of control. The evidence suggesting that staying together would inevitably lead to her death when the next crisis might not be survivable, and when luck and Carlyle's medical skills might not be sufficient to save her from injuries that future incidents would cause. Bella's pain was visible in her expression and audible in her breathing as Carlyle cleaned and stitched the wounds, the local anesthetic reducing but not eliminating the discomfort that glass cuts caused when nerves were damaged and when tissue was torn, in ways that required sutures and required careful treatment to prevent infection and to promote healing that would take weeks in human body that lacked vampire regenerative abilities. Edward watched Carlyle work and heard Carlyle's thoughts about the injuries being relatively minor, and about Bella being fortunate that the glass had not caused more serious damage, the assessment providing small comfort when the incident should never have happened, and when the birthday party that was supposed to be celebration had become disaster that confirmed Edward's worst fears about the impossibility of safely integrating human into vampire family. The family's dispersal after Bella's treatment was quiet and was somber. Jasper's mortification apparent in his thoughts, even though his control had returned once Bella's wounds were covered and once the scent was reduced through Carlyle's efficient cleanup. Alice's attempts to comfort Jasper mixed with her own guilt about the vision failure and about the party planning that had created situation where Jasper's control was tested beyond his current capabilities. Esme's thoughts were maternal and were concerned, her worry about Jasper's emotional state and about Edward's obvious distress making her want to help, but making her uncertain about how to help when the situation was complex and when simple comfort would not address the underlying problems that the incident had revealed. Edward drove Bella home in silence that was heavy with unspoken thoughts, his mind already working through the logistics of departure and through the timing of family relocation. That would need to happen quickly to prevent Bella from trying to maintain relationship that Edward had decided must end for her safety and for her future. The goodnight was brief and was careful. Edward's touch gentle, but his manner distant in ways that Bella noticed, even though she could not read his thoughts and could not know that he was already planning to leave her and was already constructing the lies he would need to tell to make the break clean and to make her believe that he did not want her, when the truth was that he wanted her desperately, but loved her enough to leave her to the human life she deserved. The family meeting that night after Bella was home confirmed the decision that Edward had made during the party. Carlyle's agreement to relocate coming partly from his own assessment that the incident demonstrated real danger, and partly from his recognition that Edward's mind was made up and that arguing would not change the decision. When Edward's guilt and Edward's fear had combined to create certainty that leaving was necessary regardless of consequences or regardless of pain that leaving would cause. Alice's protests were immediate and were passionate, her visions showing Bella's depression and showing Bella's reckless behavior in futures where Edward left. The precognitive warnings falling on deaf ears when Edward believed that temporary pain was acceptable price for permanent safety, and when he believed that Bella would eventually recover and would eventually move on to human boyfriend and human life. Esme's sadness was genuine but was resigned, her thoughts revealing that she understood Edward's reasoning, even while disagreeing with his conclusion, when she believed that love was worth risk, and when she believed that protecting Bella from all danger was an impossible goal that would fail regardless of whether Edward stayed or left. Rosalie's agreement with the departure plan was expected and was based on her consistent position that Bella's humanity should be preserved and that vampire involvement in her life was inappropriate and was dangerous. The validation from Rosalie actually making Edward question his decision when Rosalie's judgment was usually wrong, and when her agreement suggested that perhaps leaving was mistake rather than being necessary sacrifice. Emmett's thoughts revealed sympathy for Edward's position, but also revealed doubt about whether leaving would actually protect Bella, or would simply transfer the danger from vampire-related threats to human-related threats, when Bella's tendency toward accidents and toward dangerous situations seemed intrinsic to her personality, rather than being result of vampire presence in her life. Jasper's overwhelming guilt about causing the crisis made him agree with departure, even though his empathic sense told him that Edward's pain at the decision was profound and was potentially devastating, when leaving Bella would hurt Edward in ways that might never heal, despite immortal existence providing infinite time for recovery. The plan was finalized within hours. The Cullens would leave Forks within days, using Carlisle's job offer in Los Angeles as explanation for departure. The timing sudden, but not unprecedented, when medical opportunities required quick decisions and when the family had relocated before on short notice without raising excessive suspicion from human neighbors. Edward's task was to end the relationship with Bella in a way that would prevent her from trying to follow or trying to maintain contact. The clean break requiring lies and requiring cruelty that Edward knew would devastate her, but that he believed was necessary to give her permission to move on and to give her freedom to live human life without waiting for him or without hoping for reconciliation that he was determined would never happen. The walk in the woods with Bella happened 2 days after the birthday party disaster. Edward's careful selection of location away from Charlie's house, ensuring that her father would not overhear the conversation and would not intervene when Edward delivered the lies that would end their relationship and would end Bella's involvement in vampire world that had nearly killed her multiple times across their brief months together. The path through the forest was familiar from their previous walks, the trees and the moss-covered ground creating private space where human ears would not reach, and where Edward could say what needed to be said without witnesses who might complicate the clean break that leaving required. Bella's confusion was visible in her expression as they walked, her awareness that something was wrong evident in how she watched him, and how she waited for him to speak when his silence was unusual and was ominous in ways that made her anxious even before he began the speech he had rehearsed and had refined to maximize the chances that she would believe him and would accept that their relationship was ending permanently. Chassis, words came with difficulty despite the preparation. Edward's voice steady, but his internal turmoil, making each syllable painful when he told her that he was leaving Forks and that she could not come with him, and that their relationship had run its course and was ending by his choice rather than by circumstance. The cruelest lie was deliberate and was calculated. His claim that he did not want her designed to make her believe that his departure was about lack of feeling, rather than about excess of feeling, when the truth was that he loved her too much to stay and loved her too much to continue endangering her through his presence in her life. Her protest was immediate and was desperate, her voice breaking as she challenged his words and as she refused to accept what he was saying, when everything in their relationship had suggested love and had suggested commitment that should not end so suddenly and should not end without better explanation than the vague claims he was offering. His insistence that she was not good for him was transparent lie that he delivered anyway, because transparent lies were sometimes more effective than subtle lies, when the goal was to hurt badly enough that healing would require complete separation and would require abandoning hope of reconciliation. Her face crumbled as she processed his words, the visible breaking of her heart creating pain in Edward's chest that felt physical despite his lack of functioning heart and despite his vampire nature that should have made him immune to emotional suffering that humans experienced when relationships ended badly. The promise he extracted from her was an attempt to provide some protection, even as he was leaving. His request that she not do anything reckless, designed to prevent the dangerous behavior that Alice's visions had shown in futures, where Bella spiraled into depression and into activities that endangered her life through different means than vampires endangered it. Her agreement was mechanical and was distracted, her focus still on trying to understand why he was leaving and trying to find argument that would change his mind when his mind was already made up, and when no argument would be sufficient to override his certainty that leaving was necessary regardless of how much it hurt both of them. The final goodbye was simple and was devastating. Edward's last words to Bella, spoken quietly and spoken with finality, that left no room for hope and left no possibility of misunderstanding when he said goodbye, and when he turned and walked away at human pace that required more self-control than any physical challenge he had ever faced in 87 years of vampire existence. Every step away from her was agony, and every second of not turning back was victory over instinct that was screaming at him to return to her and to take back the lies and to stay with her regardless of danger and regardless of consequences. He heard her calling after him and heard her voice, breaking with sobs that made him want to comfort her, even as he forced himself to continue walking until he was out of her sight and out of her hearing. The distance creating physical separation that matched the emotional separation he had just created through lies and through cruelty that had been necessary but had been no less painful for being necessary. The family was waiting at the cars that were packed and ready for immediate departure. Alice's tearless vampire grief apparent in her expression, and Esme's sadness visible in how she embraced Edward without speaking when words would have been inadequate to address what he had just done and what he had just lost. The drive away from Forks was silent, except for the thoughts Edward could hear from his family members, Carlyle's solemn understanding and Rosalie's grim satisfaction, and Emmett's sympathetic concern creating mental chorus that Edward tried to block out when all he wanted was silence, and all he wanted was numbness that would protect him from the pain that was consuming him as miles accumulated between him and Bella. who was somewhere behind them in the forest, where he had left her with broken heart and with broken promises about future they would never have together. The months from October of 2005 through March of 2006 passed in blur of emptiness and nomadic wandering. The Cullen family settling nowhere permanently, and Edward settling nowhere at all, when remaining in one place meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Bella, and remembering meant pain that was unbearable and was unending despite time passing, and despite distance accumulating between him and Fawkes, where she remained living her human life without him. Alice's visions monitored Bella's future constantly despite Edward's prohibition against contact, her precognition showing depression and showing withdrawal, and showing the gradual disappearance of the vibrant girl who had loved Edward and who had been destroyed by his departure in ways that Alice's warnings had predicted, and that Edward had chosen to ignore when he believed temporary pain was acceptable price for permanent safety. Victoria's continued hunting created additional torment when Edward tracked the red-headed vampire obsessively across South America and across various territories where she appeared briefly before disappearing again, into patterns that suggested she was still seeking revenge for James's death and was still targeting Bella despite Edward's absence from Fawkes not protecting Bella from threats that vampire involvement had created. The self-loathing intensified when Edward recognized that leaving had not even achieved its stated purpose of protecting Bella, when Victoria remained dangerous and remained focused on completing her mate's hunt, regardless of how long it took or how much patience it required. Alice's vision in March showed Bella jumping from cliff into ocean waters, the image unclear about whether the jump was suicide attempt or reckless thrill-seeking, but clear about the outcome, when Bella's future disappeared entirely after the jump, and when Alice's precognition showed only blackness where Bella's timeline should continue. Edward's world ended in the moment Alice showed him the vision, the certainty that Bella was dead, eliminating any reason to continue existing and eliminating any purpose for immortal life that had been torture during their separation, and that would be completely unbearable if she no longer existed anywhere in the world. The decision to seek death through the Volturi was immediate and was absolute. Edward's knowledge of Aero's standing offer to join the guard or die, providing clear path to ending existence, that vampire durability otherwise made nearly impossible to end. The flight to Italy and the journey to Volterra happened in haze of grief and numbness. Edward's thoughts focused entirely on the mechanics of forcing the Volturi to kill him when they would not grant his request voluntarily, and when he would need to break their most fundamental law about secrecy to compel them to execute him for exposure that would threaten vampire civilization. The plan to reveal himself in sunlight during the St. Marcos Day festival was simple and was effective. The crowded plaza providing sufficient human witnesses that the Volturi would have no choice but to destroy him for violation that could not be overlooked or forgiven, when hundreds of humans would see him sparkling and would recognize that something impossible was happening. The preparation included removing his shirt and waiting for noon, when sunlight would be strongest, and when his diamond-like skin would be most visible to the red-robed festival celebrants who filled the square in celebration, that had no idea they were about to witness the exposure of vampire, whose death wish was strong enough to override survival instinct that had preserved him for 87 years. Bella's voice, calling his name was hallucination that Edward's grief-stricken mind created in final moments before stepping into the sunlight. The impossible sound of her saying Edward no, making him turn toward the phantom that his consciousness had conjured as comfort in death or as cruel final torture before oblivion. But the hallucination was solid and warm and real, her body colliding with his, and her arms wrapping around him, and her heartbeat audible, and her scent overwhelming when she was alive, and was here, and was preventing his exposure through her physical presence, blocking him from the sunlight that would have revealed him to the crowd. Alice's presence behind Bella explained the impossible resurrection. The vision that had shown Bella dead having been incomplete when Jacob Black's werewolf presence had hidden Bella's future from Alice's precognition and had created false certainty about death that was actually survival. The Volturi guard's arrival interrupted the reunion. Felix and Dimitri's thoughts revealing that Aro had seen Edward's suicide attempt through Alice's vision and had decided that the situation was interesting enough to warrant bringing all three of them into the Volturi throne room for judgment about what should be done with human who knew vampire secret, and with Cullens who had created exposure risk through their association with her. The audience with Aro revealed Bella's silent mind to the ancient vampire whose gift allowed him to read every thought anyone had ever had simply by touching them. His shock at encountering mine that was close to him matching Edward's own shock months earlier when he had first discovered that Bella's consciousness was inaccessible. The judgment came swiftly. Bella must be transformed or destroyed, the compromise being that Alice's vision of Bella's future transformation satisfied Aro's requirement that the law be upheld, and that human who knew their secret could not remain human indefinitely. The escape from Volterra and the flight back to Forks brought Edward and Bella together again, with understanding that separation had been a mistake, and that staying together, despite danger, was choice. They both preferred to safety through distance. The family vote upon their return gave Bella what she wanted over Edward's continued objections, the 5-2 decision in favor of her eventual transformation, creating timeline and creating certainty that she would become vampire and would spend eternity with Edward, whose resistance finally crumbled when faced with the alternative of losing her again or losing her permanently through aging and death. That immortality could prevent if he would simply accept what she had chosen and what she wanted, despite his belief that she deserved better than vampire existence and better than him. So rest now, sleepy souls, with Edward's hidden world revealed through the thoughts he heard and the thoughts he could not hear, and through the constant battle between monster and man that defined every moment with the girl whose silent mind saved him from century of loneliness. The secrets of Midnight Sun showed the depth beneath Twilight's surface, the desperate love wrapped in constant thirst, and the self-loathing transformed by her acceptance of what he was beneath the beautiful mask. Sleep well, knowing that love stories have hidden dimensions, that the silent mind speaks loudest, and that sometimes the thoughts we cannot hear matter most. Good night.